All right, everybody. Welcome back to another conversation with the Free Will Project. This time, I'm here with my buddy Derek. Um, Derek, can you give us some background about yourself?
My name's Derek, and I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, and I identify as poor. My my great grandpa was one of the casualties of the Vietnam War, but after he got home, he didn't survive reacclimating to society, and because of that, my grandma wasn't a full-grown adult when she had to start taking care of four kids by herself. And you can see how eventually that led to or contributed to my mom having me at 13. So I I grew up listening to my mom take responsibility or accountability for a decision that she couldn't possibly have made. Like it's not something that you could. It's not. It took my mom seeing several more generations of my family growing up before she realized that a 13-year-old couldn't reasonably make that decision. Couldn't be expected to
Right.
make a choice. So now, as an adult, she says things like my childhood was stolen from me. But as a kid, she said things like, that was my decision, I have to live with it. And I'm hoping that sometime before she gives up, that she recognizes, she moves the conversation one step further to society doesn't take care of the most vulnerable inside of it. You know, like, like you're almost out of there, mom. Well, I I think that growing up like that was a really big had a really big impact on my idea of what causes our decisions. Um, I feel like I've been arguing against people my whole life that we should expect certain behaviors under certain conditions. And it isn't it isn't the most efficient way to handle the problem to put it on each individual personally. Does that make sense? So
Right.
if we let people suffer so that they can learn their lessons, I really don't like it. As we we're spending a lot of energy to learn in the most inefficient way possible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wow.
Well,
Um, oh,
that's
go
what got
ahead.
me. That's it. No.
Okay. So it definitely sounds like there's like a really like serious deep story there. So I definitely want to get into that. Before we do, can we kind of learn a little bit more about like yourself and your own background and maybe your background on the subject?
Oh, well, I mean, I I don't know. Grew up I grew up in a house that moves a lot. So we switched schools a whole heck of a lot. And it's mostly because my mom was trying to land a guy, like any guy, to help form a family. It's impossible to work full time and raise your kids.
Right.
And so I have four brothers and sisters, and they all have different dads. And I'm the oldest of five, and my my little sister Lisa, or my little sister Jasmine, was the first person in my family to graduate high school. My grandma didn't, my mom didn't, I didn't, my little brother didn't, my little sister Lisa did. She's the very first person. And it's really that we were taking advice from immature people, you know? So like I got bullied in school a lot, which is just something that's gonna happen when you switch schools a lot and you're poor.
Yeah.
Um, so my mom's advice was to fight them. My grandma's advice was to fight them, but the school system doesn't agree with that advice.
Right.
So I ended up, me and my little brother both went through that, and we both got kicked out of school really early. And I ended up getting my GED and starting work at 15, and I married a person who also was a teen mom. I guess it's related. It was easy for me to relate to that problem. You know, that person's ostracized, and
Sure.
but I don't know. I've been a parent since I was 19, and now I have 4 kids, and I work basically all the time because I live in America, and um I guess that's my whole personal background.
Cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's elucidating. How'd you get into the subject of free will? You mentioned that like some of this stuff got you thinking about how people make decisions and where behavior
Yeah.
comes from. Did you
As
bump into any authors or anything that were influential?
um but well, I'm a big fan of Kurt Vonnegut, and in his view, time is fixed. You know, the facts are facts, and you can't change them. When I was a little kid, I had it in my head that I wanted to be a scientist. My family's supportive, but doesn't know how to be supportive of that kind of thing. You know, but they back then you didn't ask. There wasn't a Google. You know, and my mom struggled to read, and while my grandma can read and do math, she wasn't very highly educated, and because of that, they ended up asking the kids a lot of questions. Me and my little brothers and sisters, it was our job to answer questions for our parents instead of the other way around. And
Mm,
that means that it means that I developed like a critical and analytic view of the world really early, and I have a large amount of skepticism for the abilities of adults. You know, and that didn't go away as I got older. As a matter of fact, it became a little bit stronger as I interacted with authority figures in the world. So,
that's good. That's good.
well, it doesn't happen so much anymore. I remember being 22 and 23, and my mom still calling me and asking me questions, just like I would Google something. But over time, my answer has become how to Google the thing, and gradually that's died off.
try to
So
try to train them.
yes, exactly. It's okay. It's good for people to stand on their own feet. I guess that over time, that process pushed me into reading and writing, and well, in addition to that, I needed glasses until I was 11 years old, and I'm at like a -6, so I can't read books unless they're right here, you know. And
Wow.
my mom wasn't ever home because she's working all the time, and I didn't know I needed glasses, so I ended up reading a lot as a little kid. I wasn't allowed to sit close to TV because it's bad for your eyes, you know.
Of course, now we have like VR systems that are like glued to
Yeah,
your eyes.
that would have been so great. Or a phone, even a phone. I could have read a phone right in front of my face, but
There
it
you
just
go.
wasn't back then. Um, so I read a lot of books early. I remember reading my grandma who had bad eyesight, and I don't know. My guess is that I got more person to person interaction from the text than I did from people for most of my life. I would
Yeah,
say that pushed me into this the critical understanding of the world.
man. I'm feeling just so much of what you're saying. I'm feeling that that notion that we do need to be more like socially responsible for each other. And this is something that came up with Rosalie is like if we can understand that each of us don't really have a strong connection to our like individual responsibility. Like we're not really authoring our own individual behavior, but we do affect the world, and we can affect the way other people behave, and they can affect us. Like we could work together to create like better outcomes overall. And that's, man, that's something that like we don't get here in the United States.
Oh, if anything, you're met with hostility about it. You can't change people. People just are the way they are, and there's nothing that you can do about it. And I don't know. I feel like it's really easy to point out how your own conditions affect your decisions. So like my mom will say that she's in charge of her choices. You know, that was my choice. She loves that word. Anytime we get into arguments, if I can't talk to her about problems like addiction because that's their choice, their choice, their choice.
Yeah.
Well, if you talk about what kind of decisions people make, there's always mitigating factors in the circumstances when it comes to ourselves, but not to other people. That fundamental attribution error problem.
Yeah.
I'm late for work, but that guy speeding is just an asshole, and that's his fault. Well, if I talk to my mom about how angry she is when she misses breakfast, or how hard it is to make a decision when you're tired after work the next day, those things are perfectly fine until you talk about how those are extenuating factors in other people's decisions. And then all of a sudden it's cut and dry. It's dichotomous. They could have done otherwise. That's their fault. And it's like, all decisions are the sum of all of those factors. We're never
Right. Yeah, we somehow, like, culturally we imagine there's like all these pressures, but then there's the stuff I have control over, and it's like that control's not really there.
No,
But we need it, like, emotionally, like we feel like we need it. I don't think we actually need it, but
well, I don't know. Like, if we I think intuitively people get that if you don't understand how something is happening, it's not within your control, and not that we always think about it in those terms. It isn't until your remote doesn't work that all of a sudden you're confronted with how little you understand about a TV remote. but, but
that's really
we
good.
we we definitely understand intuitively that something that we don't know is outside of our control. It must be that if we don't know it, it is outside of our control, and we don't know how we make choices, and the feeling of control that people have in the center of their lives, in the very moment before a decision, when you know that you're about to make a decision, especially when you're demonstrating in a conversation. Well, why can't I raise my hand right now? If the conditions weren't there, if I hadn't been talking to you in advance about your will to move your hand, you wouldn't have done that. You wouldn't have chosen to do that. So even the question, can you move your hand, to put it into your mind that I'm about to do this, is a circumstance that contributes to that decision to do it. How could you have thought, well, I can move my hand right now, if I wasn't talking to you about how for you were?
Yeah,
Well,
there's no break in the causality there. It's
yeah,
all
exactly.
connected to the previous event and yeah. That's one
Would
thing
you?
people talk about. I don't know, I decided to do this, or I decided to take this action, and it's like, well, how did you know that action worked?
Right,
You knew it
right.
because someone informed you at some previous state. You knew that it was an option, and if you didn't know it was an option, you didn't do it. Like, it's yeah. There's a lot of like self-deception, like trickery around the idea that, like, I decided to do something, and we're not looking at like previous uh you know effects that lead to that cause.
How could you how could you have thought to do it? It's hard to put it into words, for real. It's not, our language isn't conducive to talking about this subject. If the option doesn't occur to you, you couldn't have considered it. You couldn't have weighed it against the other options that occurred to you.
Hmm.
It isn't possible for you to choose which ones do compete for your attention right now. Like if it didn't occur to you to scream at the top of your lungs to prove that you could make a choice to do anything, then you can't do that one. It didn't come up, so you can't make that choice. And I don't know. And then people hear that and say, well, it came up now, and so now I can make the choice to scream. And you're like, listen. It is very hard to talk about for you. But I think, like you say, they're large. We're forced to think about it because of the way that it affects our lives. It's
Hmm.
just like, I want people to recognize that people like my mom could not have chosen differently, and that they needed help. If I lived in a world with universal health care, my family would have gone to grieving therapy. My family would have um, had anyone to talk to, but they're the least able to pay for the service that they need. And we live in
Right.
a capitalistic society, and there's no way to accommodate that need in a competitive system. We have to figure out some other more cooperative way to self-effect.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it seems like the deepest needs in our society go unmet because of the
Right,
way we allocate resources. And that in itself is like socially corrosive, you know? It's not a sustainable way to organize a society.
right.
And yet here we are doing it.
Well, I don't think that we chose to be in this situation. I like we most people don't understand. Not just that that they don't want to see free will, but they don't even understand that it's a question to ask. It's a question worth asking,
Mhm.
you know. And I can't blame people. I can't blame society at large for its ignorance. It's not at fault. No, nothing is ever at fault for its ignorance.
Yeah, that's a hard pill to swallow,
Yeah,
but
it
it's
really
true.
is. People, especially in the modern setting, somebody will say, if you say that people aren't responsible for their ignorance, they say they could have Googled it. And then you ask, like, how, if the question doesn't occur to you, how do you know to ask it? You know? And people don't like thinking about it. People don't like, because it puts the onus on us, the us in the know. Now we have a responsibility to tell people or to talk to people about it or to try to get people to think. And I don't think people like having responsibility.
They want to put it on someone else.
Yeah,
Yeah.
free will perfectly lets us do that. I know for a fact that's why my mom uses it. It's a defense mechanism. It lets her wipe her hands of any duty that she has to the people around her. You know,
I've
you say we should, it's our job to make them feel like they're loved whether or not they are acting right now, because a person who isn't loved is very likely going to continue to self-destruct. And and if you believe in free will, you say, well, they could have done otherwise, and now you don't have to do anything. I can just walk
mhm.
away. That's and the people, it's, I don't know, that's insidious. If we apply that to ourselves, then we can't ask for help from other people because we could have done differently. And if we apply it to other people, then we can't help them because they could have done differently. It totally strips us of our ability to alleviate the problem.
Yeah, there's George Lakoff uses this term systemic causation, where
Systemic.
like you have like this large process that's causing its effects, and then so we're talking about all sorts of like socioeconomic conditions, and we're talking about like this like big picture stuff that creates like these like individual stories, but then we want to put all that process on the individuals that are inside that system, and it's like yeah, free will is like the perfect mechanism for taking systemic failure and just pinning it to individuals so that you don't have to change the system.
Yes, that is what it is. And I feel like it's 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 a shortcut that we use to make predictions. You know, it's a heuristic that everyone inherits as part of our theory of mind. You know, it's easier to assume that there's a reason that somebody's doing what they're doing. It's easier to assume that that this is what they chose to do or what they wanted to do, and every action that they do fits that, than it is to actually take account of all of the individual causes that go into a decision. And and well, our shortcuts are there for evolutionary reasons, you know, like
Hmm.
the theory of mind evolves because it is useful. And animals that apply that to themselves don't know that they're doing so. You know, like regular people don't know that they're reverse engineering their own decisions, that they're kind of retrodicting their behaviors instead of making them, manufacturing them. We internalize that process of prediction that we apply to other people. That's just a shortcut. You know, if they chose to do that, then there's probably a reason, and that reason probably fits with their motivations. That's a useful shortcut, and most of the time it's going to be helpful in anticipating what other people do, and it's useful for ourselves. but it is a shortcut, and it isn't the fact of the matter. And it's
Yeah,
really hard for us to get around that feeling because we evolved to anticipate, we evolved in a social setting to anticipate the behaviors of other people.
absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, like it you can see how in context, certain contexts, it does have like some utility,
Yeah, yeah.
but man, I think we're in a different context now.
Yes. Yeah.
And yeah, there's some serious liabilities to taking a shortcut like that, to just, we're like we're having such a hard time addressing climate change.
Yes.
And I think if somehow, we woke up tomorrow and we magically understood that, like, the environmental aspects of behavior and the biological aspects of behavior, and we weren't looking at everyone to just like use their free will to change their consumption habits so that everything like magically turns out okay. Like I think we could be much more effective at changing our societies to fit within like the limits of the biosphere. But as it is, we tell people to like stop using straws and stuff like that. It doesn't,
Well,
we're yeah,
it's
we're
such
go
a
ahead.
deep intuition about our actions, about why other people are acting, why animals do what they do. It's useful in our evolutionary setting to do the shortcut because it's straight up impossible to account for the actual reasons. And in a I don't want to say social Darwinist, but in a competitive social environment like our evolutionary history, it's easier to cut out harmful actors than it is to fix them. Nature
Mhm.
kind of doesn't care if this turtle shell doesn't form correctly. It just lets that one go and makes another turtle. And the same is true of our social behaviors. So if there's harmful actors that are parasitizing our society, the easiest thing for us to do as individuals is just to avoid them rather than address the problem, because time will take care of the problem. For millions of years, that was perfectly fine, and that
Good enough.
right, right. But now we live in a contained system, so there's nowhere for those people to go. We can't, and there's nowhere for us to go that can escape them. And so
Mhm.
we have to come up with some way to address the behavior rather than to contain it or to push it out. We have to come up with some way to actually change people, and that means doing more than relying on our evolutionary instincts.
Right. Yeah. I recently learned the economic terms, empty world and full world.
Ooh,
And it's these two ways of looking at, like, in an empty world, you can have an economy that grows.
because of the frontier.
There's always like new territory for people to
Yeah,
expand into and stuff. But when you hit a full world, like what we're experiencing now, like all of a sudden growth doesn't make very much sense.
right.
Um,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, like expansion means like you're trespassing onto someone else's space, which it probably always meant that, but
Yeah. In the sometimes people like I don't know if you've seen, but I'm trying to make an eco village.
nice.
I'm trying to build a tiny house village in Kentucky, and people sometimes, when I talk about these systemic problems, who know me, will say, well, why can't people do what you do? And I'm like, I'm stealing from nature because it's more defenseless than the average person. Like the hill can't stop me from taking territory from it, but the guy who owns that apartment for sure can. And eventually we're going to run out of nature to take, and I don't think that that's a sustainable solution. I'm not doing this because everyone in the world should do this. I'm doing this because I live in America and there aren't a lot of options.
Right. No, that's exciting though. I'm very fascinated by the idea of eco villages, and I think, um like you say, maybe it's not like the permanent solution, but I do think it's some kind of step towards a solution for
Yeah.
people to think about sustainable, or at least more sustainable living than what we currently do.
Well, it for sure makes me think about ways that we're organizing society unsustainably. Like all of these centralized power structures that are pushing out energy across thousands of miles. We can decentralize power at this point. There's no reason for us to, and there's like human waste is squicky in our setting. You know, we don't deal with it very often, but it really is a huge source of nitrogen, and it isn't recycled back into the system. We just divert it. And just like, have you seen what New York does, where they compress it into bricks and store it in coal mines, and you're like, well,
What?
that's why even whatever. So
Literally shipwrecks.
yeah, it's you know, we use the puns, and we essentially accelerate the process of bacteria breaking it down, but there's no reason why we can't create more closed systems like spaceship Earth. There's no reason why we can't make this more sustainable. I'm not pushing eco villages, and I don't want us to try to regress. I don't think that we could stay competitive as a society with other more advanced societies if we move back to like personal agriculture, and I don't think so. It seems to me like as we move into the future, more and more people are going to be forced into science, and more people are going to be forced into education based jobs. You know, like I don't think that we're going to become more primitive as we go forward. I don't think that's an option, really.
No, I don't either. Although I do think your observation about decentralized energy is like really important.
Yeah.
There's so much in the way of technology that's emerging right now that's allowing us to like really scale decentralization, so that
Yeah.
you might be able to actually run like a major city or a major grid based off of like what individual buildings can generate and extract from the environment, what wind or solar they might be able to pull.
That should hold true for a long time too. An individual roof is capable of producing so much more power than what that one house needs. And even if our energy demands scale or continue to grow, we're still going to stay ahead of that for a good while. And that's not the technology that makes it possible, like grid size batteries. Those are becoming more and more cost effective every day. I
Mhm.
don't think we have to push decentralization. I think decentralization will happen on its own. The time to push it would have been 20 years ago. You know?
Yeah, yeah, it seems like we should have made a lot of decisions a few decades ago.
Well, we didn't have any competitors. You know, if there was an even one other society that was a threat, we would have
Mhm.
made decisions. But we essentially rested on our laurels for 50 years. You know.
Yeah, we didn't use our free will the right way. Damn.
No, that's not, the conditions didn't push us. There was no incentive.
Exactly.
Yeah. I
Exactly.
I I don't know. I think that okay, so you know how when you and I talk about automation, we talk about the future of unemployment, and how over time the vast majority of people today, and as the tasks that they're doing today, aren't going to be useful in those roles. Like we were going to have to come up with some other
Right.
system for. Well, if we had a universal basic income, my mom would have finished school. I would have finished school. My little brother would have finished school. My mom, when she lost her dad, would not have lost both parents. You know, but when she lost her dad, she lost her mom too, who had to now work full time to take care of all of her kids. And
Hmm.
and if we had a universal basic income, that none of that would have happened. But I don't think that universal basic income is going to push us all into unemployment. I think over time, I don't think even automation is going to push us all into unemployment. And I haven't gotten to talk to you about it. Over time, I think we're all going to move into the scientific sector, for the reason that there's a limited amount of time that all of us have to learn, and the border of science is growing. Is When science grows, like Carl Sagan's "A Candle in the Dark," the edge of our questions grows faster than the knowledge that we gain,
Right.
and we are already at the point where we've had to add 8 more years of school to the school that we used to do, and we're going to hit diminishing returns. And the way that society deals with it now is by specializing the sciences further and further and further, requiring requiring any scientific endeavor to be a cooperative enterprise. I feel like as we move on to the future, that's not going to slow down, and we're hitting diminishing returns on how much information individuals can acquire, and we're going to need to further specialize and differentiate and recruit society into the task. I don't think that we're ever going to. I don't think work is going to go away. I think the nature of work will change.
I think that's a good way of putting it. Because yeah, it's a little too simple to say the end of work, even though like I'll use phrases like that, but
Hmm.
it is it can give some people like the wrong image about what you're trying to convey. And I do think that saying like the nature of work will change, like I don't think we're gonna have to compel people to show up for a certain amount of hours every week,
No,
or you know, at the threat of like not making rent or not eating or something like that. I think that's going away.
for
But
sure. That's
people,
the best way to get people to do a job.
it's not you know, what we really want is to like tap into that like intrinsic motivation that people have,
Yeah,
into like the natural curiosity, which is perfectly compatible with like a career in science. It's like that's
yeah,
what you want. So yeah, that's, I would definitely hope to see more and more people moving into like you say, like the scientific sector, and you know, contributing to our overall like growth of knowledge, and maybe refining our the way we organize as a society, you know, finding better models.
I think that we don't have a choice. I think that's going to happen into the future. And I just like you say, I don't think it's going to be that we're forced. Like that if we had basic income, suddenly 99% of research grants are unnecessary. Like
Mhm.
if I want to go and study this fungus that's growing on the side of a rock in Nevada, I can just go and do it. I get the check anyway. I All I have to do is report my studies. It isn't unless I'm working with a lot of equipment that I have to start asking for grants again. And that's about the space to be around the equipment more than it is about supplying me my food in a world where we already have basic income, right?
Right.
So we could easily accommodate the vast majority of research just by supplying people their needs, because research doesn't always require that kind of equipment, doesn't require that many participants. If I'm doing a social science study, and every one of the scientists in the thing has $1,000 a month, they can easily ask people, or they can easily personally come up with the funds to pay people to answer questions, or to
Right.
try, or to pick a cup while the music is playing in a certain way. It isn't the reason that we struggle so much now is because, in addition to doing the tests, we are also requiring the science itself, the process of asking questions, to pay for those people to eat, and that just doesn't make sense. That's not Those two shouldn't be connected.
I couldn't agree more. And this is kind of, I think, what occurred to me while you were talking there was that we have this narrative about human nature in our society, and I think it relates back to both like our sort of Christian myths, and also our myths around capitalism, that like humans have some sort of like nefarious nature about themselves,
Yeah.
like we're either lazy or we're sinful, or something like that, that like you can't really trust people. And uh, what I think, or at least what I've picked up from anthropology and from reading elsewhere, is that like we're not really all that shitty. We're all
No,
right, like
no.
for the most part.
We have separate systems. We have separate systems for moderating our behavior when we're stressed versus when there's abundance.
There
You
you
know,
go.
we that's that we find that in chimpanzees, and we find that in mammals down to mice will engage in more pro-social behavior when they're not stressed, right?
Uh,
And that makes perfect sense in an evolutionary setting. If you put 500 rats in a room and they're all well fed, they'll spend most of that time grooming each other. But if you put 500 rats in a room and they're not well fed, they will all spread out really far, as far as they can, to avoid coming into contact with each other. And it's like, how can we look at animals doing this and then think that we are always one way or the other. We are by default more one way than the other. That doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, so much of it comes down to environmental influence. And to me, like the natural extension of that is, well, let's get to work fixing the environment that we all inhabit, right?
Yeah.
Like that,
Yeah.
it just follows. And so
Well,
like, oh, go ahead.
not everyone who is in control of the circumstances regarding our environment believes in free will. I don't think it is just that the guys at the top are ignorant of the real problems in the world. That I run into a lot of people who don't believe in free will, but are otherwise very social Darwinist, right?
Hmm.
And I think that the competitive system that we're in selects those people to rise to levels of control. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
If
It's
we if we had sat and had a conversation with I don't know, every senator, we're likely to run into both sides of the conversation. It isn't just going to be that everybody in control believes in free will and believes that we are responsible for the problems in the world as individuals. It's going to also be that the people at the top think that winning is more important than winning now is more important than winning in the long run, right? How can you win in the long run if you don't win now? And
yeah.
that, I I I think that I think that I personally I think social Darwinism is bullshit. I think that it's an unsustainable ideology.
I think
How
you're
could
correct.
the human brain is the most adaptive thing on the planet. That's its job, and the amount that any organ can adapt can change with the lifetime of the individual is the resistance that it has to genetic change. If that blunts the force of selection against my genes and any change that I can make in my current setting. And so that would mean that our brains have are in every way that they are behaving are blunting the force of genetic pressures on them, genetic selection pressures on them. Well, how could that means that our brains would evolve genetically more slowly. Granted that culturally they evolve very, very fast, but genetically they should evolve more slowly than say our hearts, because I can't make choices in my day to affect how well my heart behaves, but I can make choices to affect how well my brain adapts to this circumstance. And well, I don't see how letting people be poor is going to select out genes toward impulsivity or whatever you think makes people poor, whatever you, Mr. Social Darwinist, believes makes people poor. I I I don't think that I think if it would take tens of thousands of generations for us to actually select at that marginal rate toward a less impulsive person, then we could do that at the same time we can make a legal change that in 3 generations affects the impulsivity of millions of people. And I don't think that the best way to handle our situations is to let it resolve itself. I think the brain is specifically acting against that force in the world. I think it's blunting selection.
Yeah, we have so much research that shows, like you mentioned, the effects of stress, and how, like, if you're poor, the constant need to resist impulses due to just not being able to afford like a cheeseburger or a beer or whatever, that's very taxing on your system, and over
Yeah,
time
yeah,
that makes it harder to make good decisions. Whereas like if you're middle class, you don't need to resist those impulses, and you're more likely to be able to make sustainably better choices over time. And so like we know, just like economic stress, like ignoring all the other sources of stress, just like economic stress alone has a really big effect on how well we can make decisions in our life. And
right.
it's not like a genetic thing. It's we see it, in any poor people. And it's
Yeah, yeah. And well, even if it were a genetic thing, we could better affect those people or those genes by changing the environment that is in its reaction to those genes than we could by letting them try to select themselves out. It would take tens of thousands of years
Oh
for us
yeah.
to make even a slight change to our genes, but we can make a cultural change in a single decade. I mean, there's no reason for us to choose to do this at a turtle's pace at the cost of billions of people's lives. You know, it's
Yeah,
not
yeah, biological evolution's not a quick process.
right. Yeah, the economy that we're trying to make people adapt to is not going to be around for 10,000 years. It doesn't make sense to try to force people genetically to suit this situation that's not gonna exist at the scale of genes. It's not.
That's also like super weird and like eugenicsy to like try to like shape people into this like artificial economy instead of
Well,
creating an economy that actually adapts to who we are already. Like I don't,
eugenics is a dead idea, in my opinion. Like 100
I hope
years,
so.
if we gain, eventually all of genetics is going to be memetics. Eventually we will develop the power to affect our genes, and all of the any if you spent millions of dollars or millions of people's lives trying to affect the human gene pool, every single hour that you did that was wasted. As soon as we develop the ability to move DNA around, everything that you ever did means nothing. And there's no reason, there's literally no reason for you to try to affect the population of genes in the world when one day we're going to buy and sell them on the internet. You know,
Yeah,
I
I
want to
mean,
call Shaquille O'Neal, you know, and um, I don't I don't think if you started right now in 1,000 years, you would have made very little headway into changing the genes of the human species, and you would have in the time in that interval impeded us in every way imaginable. You know, whereas we could just wait, and all of our genes will improve with the understanding of them.
yeah, and it just yeah, like you say, it's just not efficient.
No,
I don't even think it would be that effective. Like
right? Yeah, yeah,
and really like really the real regulator of genes is environment, and it's part of our phenotype that we shape our environment. Let's just shape the environment. Like
yeah,
let's
yeah,
it's so much
yeah.
easier. It makes us so much sense. Um,
Well,
but for some reason we're not quite conscious on that level yet as a whole.
it's
And I
hard to
don't
be, you
yeah,
know.
I don't know how to get us there other than I don't know.
This
We
is
have conversations like this, I guess.
yeah. And I'd say this is a great work. This is great work you're doing to get us there. And
Hey,
I do the same thing in my own life. I talk to people about free will, even though I think it's just about the most difficult conversation to have with a person. You know,
yeah.
people have a strong emotional reaction to free will, and I feel like they have personally have it backwards. You know, like we were saying earlier, it strips you of your ability to affect yourself, or to and it lets you wipe your hands of your responsibility to other people. Well, if I were to decide, say, to stop biting my nails, and I just choose to be a better person and not bite my nails today, I just choose really hard right now, chances are I'm not going to succeed. But if I develop a system or like if I change my environment to make it harder to bite my nails, I ask my wife to paint my nails, I put strings on my fingers, I dip them in Tabasco sauce, something, you know, I'm gonna have a much greater chance of success. And we all know this. If I talk to when I talk to people about whether or not they could choose to remember to do something, very often they'll immediately go to affecting their environment. They'll say, well, I could put an alarm on my phone, or I could tie a
Yeah.
string around my finger. And I'm like, those are all great ways, but you can't just want it harder. That's not gonna do it.
No,
I
the alarm on the phone is the perfect example of like how you affect the environment so that it shapes your behavior
yeah,
rather than just willing yourself to remember something later. Now, for this conversation, I set an alarm on my phone
yes.
because I knew if I didn't do that, there's a not insignificant chance that I'll be flighty and I'll miss it, and I'd be embarrassed. So
I'd be really embarrassed. I did the same thing. I set an alarm on my phone to make sure that I didn't oversleep. which is just much, much more likely to be successful than just thinking really hard before I go to bed. Remember, you have to wake up. But what's the difference between that and trying to tell yourself to remember that you have to do something tomorrow? It's people like, well, it's risky thinking that you're just going to remember to wake up on time. Well, it's also risky thinking that you're just going to remember to call that person. This is
Right.
the same problem. How do I make myself come back into consciousness relevant to this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to know, are you a determinist or are you an indeterminist?
Um, I don't really see any. I don't like have any knowledge of indeterminism.
Okay.
But I found the whole argument around hard incompatibilism to be fairly compelling once I got my head wrapped around it.
Yeah,
And
right.
personally, I don't know what randomness means. Like
Yes, yeah,
like
yeah.
I can't make sense of it. So it's one of those things where it's like, well, I'm willing to leave space in my thinking for that to mean something in the future, but for now, like I mean, to me, the difference between determinism and hard incompatibilism, or some sort of distinction like that, is mostly about like how someone's going to respond to you, like in a debate or something. Like,
Yeah.
there's not really a practical difference there for me.
So I feel the same way. I feel like it depends on the person that I'm talking to, whether I'm going to talk about determinism or whether I'm going to talk about how there's no way of thinking that nets you free will. It's going to be, it's
Hmm.
really, if they start talking about their soul, then I'm going to just grant them that they have a soul. And now let's talk about whether that would net you free will. But I don't personally, I don't think indeterminism is real. I don't think that randomness makes sense. And it's a conversation that I try really hard to get into on our reasonably forum, but it's a difficult one to have. I like there's random in the sense that the digits of pi are random, but we know the digits of pi are fixed. If I
Hmm.
if I chose to build a random number generator off pi in every way, it would seem random to a person, but it's actually predictable in a real sense. And it seems to me like anything that we describe as random is going to run into this problem. That people will talk about quantum mechanical effects, but those are the most accurate predictions that we've ever made, and they perfectly conform to the formula that we use to map out the motions of these waves. And it doesn't make sense to me that it can be both random and conforming. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I always wonder if our perceived random, like what we perceive as random, is in some way reflective of our current state of ignorance.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Like if in the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, there's this view of random where I am somewhere in the probabilistic set, but the whole set exists. Like the whole set of probability is present, and what's random is which one that I am. My ignorance about my position relative to the others, not which one actually occurs. And it's hard for me to picture a world that doesn't work that way. Whether or not it's many worlds, it's hard for me to picture a world where randomness isn't always about our ignorance about our position. It's the world is proportional to itself. It is always. I heard you say in one of your videos earlier that some degree of paradox is probably intrinsic, and I just find it. I find that hard to believe about nature. I find it hard to believe that nature isn't completely and wholly self-consistent. You know.
Huh. Yeah, I don't I wish I knew which video that was.
If I think it's one of the ones where you're talking to Roy, but I'll look it up and see if I can't find it.
Okay. Yeah, no, because I yeah, I can see myself saying that. I'm sure I did. Um,
Well, it
yeah,
just
and
I
maybe I was thinking of like an internal paradox, like in our own like subjective experience. I don't know.
Okay, okay.
Um,
I'm not trying to tell you what your position is. I just heard you say it, and I hear people say that. My friend Cassiopeia says that to me. They really love Deleuze, and so we argue about paradoxes a lot. And they say that paradox is just part of the world and it's unavoidable. And I'm like, every paradox that we've ever found in science before has been the doorway to a bigger, broader scientific theory. You know, the paradox
yeah,
is light being a wave and a particle are what drove us toward asking that question. Why, how can it self-interact in this way and still be in a fixed point? Those two are impossible to reconcile given the Newtonian view of the world. And
yeah,
without that paradox, without people fixating on it as if it weren't right that it should be self-contradictive, we wouldn't have developed quantum mechanics. We would have just settled with objects. An object in motion stays in motion. Things have clear linear positions in the world, and I don't think that we can ignore. If we ignore contradiction, we do so at our own peril. You know.
yeah. I definitely think like it is definitely like counterintuitive that contradiction should be a part of the natural world.
Yeah.
Um, I I, I think maybe I remember a little bit about what I was talking about. I'm not sure. But yeah, I know I've struggled with like the idea of like the law of non-contradiction. Um, but the way I struggle with it is that sometimes I feel like people um instead of actually like wrestling with an idea, people like impose that on the process. And I think sometimes it makes sense
Like a
to at least
dichotomy.
I think it makes sense for people to at least attempt to hold contradictory ideas in their mind sometimes to look for resolution in the future.
Well, and I agree with that too. I agree that if we if I it seems all right, this is hard. There's a unity of opposites in any two dichotomies. So like if up and down aren't opposites each other, they are mirrors of each other on a continuum where both sides can perfectly be imposed upon the other side and match. There's actually just direction, and direction accounts for up and down. You know, and there's a unity in up down. There's a unity in polarity that is magnetism. There's a greater thing that contains both opposites and a gradient between the two. And if we just said it's either or, we would have put it down. You know, it can't
Yeah.
both up and down. Well, it can be. It can both be up and down. It depends on which way you're looking at it. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. I think I agree with what you're saying. Like I wouldn't ever I don't know. It's important to wrestle with contradiction.
Right. Yes,
Yeah.
I agree with that. And I think that we shouldn't accept contradiction, but that we should thoroughly examine it because it is usually where we're going to find new ground.
Yeah, I think we probably can't help it that like when things don't make sense, that's what really gets the brain
Really
going.
helpful. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
That's I mean that's really the way I ended up thinking about free will skepticism is you know a lot of influences probably pushed me here, but the stuff that really started not making sense on the conscious level is when I was learning more and more about social science and how like societies like, oh, if you have a society structured in this way, then these outcomes are predictable. And I'm like, well, how
How
does
does
that
that
how does that make sense? Or like if you think about like leftist philosophy, there's a lot of discussion about like material conditions. And it's like, well, how does that make sense with people making their own individual decisions and determining their like these things like can't all be true,
yeah,
and
yes.
you really start wrestling with it, and eventually you come to the idea that like I don't think I really am like authoring my life. Like
No,
I
I
think
don't I don't think that I think that conclusion is unavoidable. That if we examine the ways that people behave in large groups, we're going to find that they converge in those behaviors. They converge upon utility that is in a predictable manner. And or they don't in a predictable manner if they're deprived. And I feel like you can't hold that view and believe that we're the free authors of our choices, unless you like have some statistical view of the world. Like there's 5 Derek's, and we're all in different bodies making the same decisions. They're just I don't think that that's a tenable position. If we can author our decisions, it is in response to our environment. There's like a synthesis of the two views, of the individualistic view and the socialistic view, where it's not enough to build a society that's good for the largest number of people if that society doesn't advance in any progressive way, right? Like, it can be good in a sustainable way. We could all go back to eco villages, and that can be good for the greatest number of people in our current setting, and still not be the most sustainable way to behave. Another country that industrializes faster than us could just displace us. But we have to synthesize this view that people are the result of their environments, but they also have abilities, and those abilities, granted, are in reaction to the environment, but have to be accounted for. And so whatever system that you and I come up with is going to produce incentives that are structured to make individuals act as collectives. It isn't going to ignore that there are individuals. It isn't going to care just about the collective over the plight of the individual. It's going to make use of what powers individuals have to form stronger, more cooperative groups.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say that when people talk about leftist politics and they talk about socialism, they usually think like this all or nothing. It's for the many, and it cannot be. It cannot be that we can have a society that is organized for the benefit of the most people, and it ignores the way that individuals function. It cannot be.
Yeah, a realization that I had around this at some point was that we want to be maximizing the well-being not only of the whole, but of the individuals within the whole, and that those two goals really go together. They're not opposing. You have to look at it as a system, and you're really looking for the synergy of all of those different markers, like the whole and the individuals. Like, you're looking for the synergy of all of it being maximized simultaneously. And if we know anything about the well-being of individuals, it's that autonomy is a big part of that.
Yeah.
And so
if you're raising a kid, you want to give them the chance to make choices for themselves, and to fail for themselves, and to experience that failure, and to try again. And if you don't do that, you're depriving them of their own growth, and you can't deprive society of the growth of individuals without depriving society. You can't do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it almost seems talking about paradoxes, it almost seems paradoxical that one should value autonomy, and yet one also says, like, we don't have free will, or like, I don't believe in free will. But I think these are really two different things. Autonomy.
You're definitely.
Yeah. I think autonomy is still something you can value in the way that, like, you want your kid to be able to navigate the world successfly.
Yeah, I don't want to have to micromanage.
Yeah, and you can do that without thinking that kid is the author of his actions. Like, you can, and that's exactly why you would parent. That's why you would improve your parenting.
I want to set up the conditions for their own experiments to be safe and to be likely to produce the outcomes that are best for my kid. I'm not going to say they need to learn to climb and fail on their own and then have them do so out over the concrete. I'm going to do it over a soft space. They're just more likely to succeed in that way. And if I think, oh, well, they have free will, they could have succeeded climbing if they really wanted to, well, I'm going to produce worse outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of good stuff, like, right there in that it's not contradictory to want people to have control over their lives in one sense, and yet also to tell them they're not actually authoring their behavior. I think we want, like you said, you want to set up the conditions to where people can move autonomously through the world.
I don't see how there's an alternative. Some people will say if it's better for me to make my own decisions, then we can choose the decisions that come out of the aggregate of people doing that. But it's possible for all of us competing to produce a worse outcome. If we're all lined up on a beach trying to sell popsicles, right? The best outcome is that that the whole beach is covered, that there's some kind of like a zone for each stand, and they don't overlap too much because it's a waste of space and there's too many stands. But what's actually going to happen in a competitive environment is that they're all going to slowly try to steal each other's customers, even though that's not most efficient for the most people. They will gradually come to sit all in one spot, and we all have to walk to the dang popsicle stand. And the world does that. Like, those shopping centers all gradually come in one place because they're trying to compete with each other more than they are trying to best serve us, and that's at our expense. We as individuals aren't competing automatically going to produce the best and most cooperative ends. We're going to produce the strategies that survive best in conflict with themselves.
Yeah, that's competition's a big conversation. Because we live in a hyper competitive, culture,
Yeah.
where we value it, and we're like teaching our children at the youngest ages, you have to dominate the other person. And
I heard my sister ask me, why even teach my kid to share? There's no sharing in the world. They're just going to buy their own things. I'm like, how it's really annoying when you talk to somebody and they don't give you a chance to speak? That's sharing. It's really annoying when you're sitting on the couch with your significant other and they want to control where the TV goes all the time. That's also sharing. Like, and every conversation that you ever have with another person, every time somebody's ever wanted to hear you out when you were sad, those are all sharing. It isn't just the stuff in the world. The fact that we can stuff is not going to eliminate the need for us to share our time and our cognitive space.
oh man, that's a good point.
Well, I think about it when people say that we live in a hyper capitalist society. I think about my mom and my little sisters saying, well, is sharing really a necessary thing to teach your babies? So, oh my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, this is like the most unpopular position you could take on competition, is like, I think it's just, maybe for the survival of an individual inside of a competitive context, maybe it's important to gain those skills. But overall, like, a competitive context is harmful for everyone within it, like even for the winners.
Yeah.
I think really this is another one of those areas where I want people to start thinking critically and being skeptical about just
Well,
the
think about what competition means in the context of, let's say, a business context. So if I'm a customer and I'm going to buy a product, let's say, sometimes people say this about medicine. If the prices were up front, I would go to a different store. I would go to a different hospital. That's crazy. I'm dying. I'm going to take whatever one's available. But
wait, who's got the best deal on heart attacks? Like,
right. Well, you can listen to Dinesh D'Souza really say this over and over and over again.
That guy, I don't know what to say about that guy.
If it weren't for Matt Dillahunty, I would never listen to him. So, but if there were prices set up front and I were to go to the hospital, see the prices, go to another hospital, see those prices, and shop around to finally decide, we didn't solve the problem of pricing. We just individualized it. We put all of that work on that person. So if it took me an hour with a spreadsheet to come up with the best possible prices for all the hospitals, I did more work than the thousands of people who are going to have to do that every single day. And we just ignore that cost because it's outside, out of mind, There's no competitive environment that doesn't do this, that doesn't individualize the cost of shopping around at the very least, even if we're not fighting each other, is
Right.
still individualize this cost of research, this cost of cross analysis, and that's assuming that they get it right. That's assuming that individuals are actually buying the cheapest thing. They still paid with their time to shop around, and the truth is that they don't buy the cheapest thing. That we have a limited amount of time to shop, and we have a limited information available to us, and we have to make the best choice. And a lot of people are paying for our inability to cross-examine actuarial tables with their lives. They're doing it with their whole lives.
Absolutely. Holy shit. And you know, I was in a conversation earlier today, and I was talking about how like cost efficiency, even though it sounds good, it's actually a problem because first off, like it externalizes a lot of costs. So a lot of
Yeah,
times the lowest price is actually contributing to other problems that are, like you say, out of sight, out of mind.
right.
And
There's
then
people in developing nations who are not able to give their kids their culture because they've had these factories stamped onto their culture, and all their time is spent trying to make a living for this product to be $1 cheaper for me. But I don't see that. I just see two items in the store, and one says $8 and one says $7. I'm gonna pick the $7.
right, right, and that's being rational. And also, you know, we look at competition as like, oh well, you have like these three different providers and they're all competing with each other, and that's how you get the lowest price. But we never ask the question like, what would the price be if they were collaborative, right?
Right.
Right.
We're running this. We're in addition to the cost, in addition to the cost of building a business, we're building an entire second copy of it so that we can reduce the cost marginally. Well, is the second copy more than the marginal reduction? Like, if so, then we're wasting resources being redundant in places we don't need to be. You know,
Yeah,
there's if I start a business trying to make a better car and you start a business trying to make a better car and we're both competing with each other, all the research that we did independently could have been done together. And we don't account for that cost, the cost of duplicating it unnecessary.
yeah,
Unnecessary. That's
yeah. We're very redundant with our limited resources, and that doesn't make sense, you know. And we burn through them quicker because of cost efficiency instead of what I contrast cost efficiency with is resource efficiency, which would be like,
that is a much, yeah, that is brilliant.
yeah,
Cost.
which would be like an objective analysis of like what the potentials of given resources are, instead of what's the
Look at it,
cheapest product I can put on the market.
when you look at it that way, I mean, I love those two terms, that resource efficiency versus cost efficiency. That's brilliant. If you look at it that way, you immediately see how redundancy is inefficient. The resources allocated in the most efficient possible way aren't going to go through two different allocation systems. It's never going to. It's not like the
Yeah,
clearly there's space inside of the FedEx trucks and the UPS trucks, and if we just consolidated our fleet, this wouldn't be a problem.
right, right. But then, oh goodness, you're talking about Big Brother and like the centralized state and all this stuff, and that's where like you mentioned decentralization earlier, and I still think that's a very important part of this whole picture. And I think you know, we're getting decentralization in communication, we're
Yeah,
getting decentralization logistically, and we're getting it through our energy systems. And this is what Jeremy Rifkin talks about, you know, as like the Internet of Things, is like whenever all these different decentralized systems come together and allow us to manage the world in like a basically like a novel way. Like we're talking about like just a whole different approach.
my fridge tells the supermarket exactly how much milk I'm going to drink on a given month, but on average for the last 15 years. And there's no way that that doesn't do a better job of predicting how much milk I'm going to need than me, time deprived on my way to work, You know, like we will develop an economic system that predicts our desires and needs better than we do, and then suddenly consumer demand will disappear as a actor in the marketplace. It just doesn't make sense.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah, like the goal of need fulfillment, like understood more objectively, makes so much more sense than what we're doing now. And it's so much more efficient with resources. And people, there's a lot of gray areas with that, and a lot of stuff people get worried about, and that's fair.
well,
Who has control over your life and things like that.
honestly, I feel like the people who have the strongest concerns, the people who are the most scared or the most angry at the idea of change, they do more to inculcate change than the people who are just enthusiastic about it. Because like 1984 did more to make people aware of what cameras could do to our lives than any person talking about how cool cameras were. You know, like I
I
feel
like
like
that.
those people do a lot of good. I really like finding people who are emotional about their negative reaction to the thing. It's better than somebody who says, "Oh, well, that's never going to happen. I don't have to think about it." That person is for sure not contributing to the conversation. But somebody who says, "The robots are coming," you know, that guy's getting a lot of people thinking about robots, whether or not that's what he wants. You know.
So what you're saying is I'm doing it wrong. I should be warning people about the dangers of abandoning free will. My God, society will fall apart.
Well, if you were warning people, you would, as a byproduct, produce a whole lot of free will skeptics. Isn't that true?
I think it's true. I don't know how to argue with that. And I mean I've even thought about this. Like there's a lot of people that do like satirical work, and they will hit that same vibe with people where like they are kind of warning you about the future, but they're doing it with a wink. And it's maybe that is the way to communicate with people. I don't have that level of talent,
I
so
was gonna say I'm not best suited to that myself. It's hard.
yeah.
It's hard for. I'm gonna end up being accidentally enthusiastic. Isn't that so cool? I can't.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a very significant thought though, that like maybe there's some like counter propaganda that's actually more effective than just straightforward like propagating your point of view. I don't know.
Well, if that's the kind of competition that we're going to face in the new world, then I'm all for it. You know, like this physical resource competition is not fun. I'd much rather us
Yeah.
be arguing about whether or not an idea is good for us. That's a much better field of competition than the one I'm born into. I feel like if as long as the goal is to keep people talking about the conversation, we're doing good. You know, if whether or not we're doing so in an inflammatory or negative way, or we're doing so in a positive and educational way, we're still getting the conversation talking. You know, we're getting people going, and that's sometimes people will criticize me for being uneducated and talking about these scientific topics,
Oh
and
geez, how dare you.
um, it happens a lot. You know how you're making strong claims about scientific truths, and it's like, well, one, the best thing that could happen to me in this conversation is that you tell me how and why I'm wrong. You know, that would
Right.
be great. But also, if say for example I did the worst possible thing that I could do from my position of ignorance, and I got a million people spouting the same bullshit line, we'll say it's now a new I forget what you call it when a lot of people believe something that's false. It's now a new misunderstanding, common misunderstanding. um if that happens, the level of conversation has still gone up, because now there's a new starting point for people who are in the know. They say, well, lots of people say this, but it's actually the case that, and then regular people can connect to it because they have that misunderstanding. You know, it's still a jumping off point for the conversation, a million times easier to have than, listen, I know this doesn't seem important, but
Yeah, let me start from scratch on a
yeah, yeah,
complex issue.
So
Yeah,
so that I don't think that I don't even in the worst case scenario, you're still helping just by making the subject known to people, whether or not you're teaching people accurately.
that's hilarious. That's counterintuitive, but I'm not gonna argue with you.
Well, if you did argue with me, I would probably enjoy it. The the point is that I don't think that you're going to do more harm than good by trying to understand out loud.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. Something that you were reminding me of, I mentioned George Lakoff earlier. He does a lot of work in linguistics and neurology, and specifically on political framing, on how to like sell people on certain messages based off of, you know, their preconceived values and biases. And what you seem to be describing, I think he would call like reinforcing a frame, or at least these two things are related. That like even when you are like arguing it, like one of his books is called "Don't Think of an Elephant," and of course, when you say that, the first thing that comes to mind is an elephant. And so it's like even when you're trying to negate a frame, you're actually reinforcing it. And so
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
so like
Yes.
I think there's something similar there. Maybe they're not a one-to-one thing, but yeah, somehow we're all kind of uh even if we're not doing it perfectly, we're like reinforcing a bigger conversation that we're a part of.
That's my hope. So that is my sincere hope. The sometimes you can worry that we're by talking so much about how there isn't free will, we're reinforcing the position that there is. But in cases where it's the default already, we don't have too much to fear. You know, at least there's some piece of their mind now that's saying, well, not everybody thinks so.
Yeah, yeah, I wonder if we are making some sort of tactical error by talking about free will instead of using some sort of alternative frame, but
Yeah, I,
I don't.
I wonder about that too. But you don't. It doesn't feel like we have a choice because
Yeah,
there's a way to connect. Like if I say determinism to somebody and I talk about the laws of physics, it doesn't immediately connect to them that we're in that idea that our everything about us is inside of that description, and
yeah,
and it is.
we feel like we're immune.
But the words you say the words no free will and instantly someone gets what you're saying. They know that you're saying this. People will the response that I get in the world is, so you think we're robots, you know? And it's,
Kind
well,
of.
what would we I don't understand what the alternative is.
Right.
um, I don't I can't put down the utility that how easy it is to connect with someone over the idea. Whether or not their reaction to it is useful depends. It really depends.
Yeah, if someone else wants to reframe the conversation, have at it. That's above my pay grade. So
I'm for sure trying to figure out how. I'm for sure trying to figure out how to talk to people in a way that's more productive than what's currently happening. But
yeah, to be honest, I don't have this conversation with too many people in my immediate life.
yeah,
It's
I,
generally, I'm sorry.
I said that's surprising.
It's generally I have with some people, but there's a whole lot of conversations I have before this one.
Yes, yeah, that's true. Yes, yeah,
and
yeah.
and by the time I've either decided like I want to have this conversation with someone or I don't want to have this conversation, I generally have like a feeling about like how they would react to it and what would be a good approach. Or like uh I don't know, like my significant other, we talk about this from time to time, or like I've got a couple of close friends that are more or less on board with, you know, my point of view on the conversation. But yeah, this isn't really, I don't really feel like the maybe you'd call it like the evangelical impulse, like
Oh, yeah.
like where I gotta like stop people on the street corner and like hold up a sign that says no free will.
It
I don't.
isn't something. It isn't something that we can avoid talking about. So I don't feel like I have to bring it up. You
There
know,
you
like
go.
it comes up on its own all the time. I just there's no if as soon as we start talking about how best to change any human behavior at all, we're going to be stuck having this conversation about free will. The thing that you said about how you have like a personal estimation after enough conversations with how they're going to take the subject. I
Mhm.
think that's what I'm talking about when we're doing the when we're applying our theory of mind. You know, we're taking the positions that the things that we think a person cares about, and that we think that the information that we think that they have, and we're estimating how they're going to react to a given circumstance. And we're doing that to ourselves. That's the hard part to see for regular people in our own lives. We are applying that same process to our own actions. We're not authoring them. We're after the fact describing them to ourselves with that same estimation that we would use for another person to see how they would react to something. You
Yeah,
know,
I think
if I
that's a. Oh, go ahead.
if I ask you in the supermarket, if you say all of a sudden, "Oh, we need chips," right? And I say, "Why did you say we need chips?" Because that question is so off-putting, nobody ever asks. You're gonna have to take a second. You usually say, "Oh, I was looking at this shelf, I guess, and it has the chips here." And my question is, when you do that, if you had seen another person also looking at that shelf saying, "Oh, I need chips," wouldn't you have applied the same reasoning? Like, why is your reasoning, as it pertains to you, privileged? Like, why do you have this special knowledge about why you did things as opposed to why that person remembered just then to buy chips? Why do we think we have privileged knowledge about our own experience?
Yeah, we feel. I think it comes down to like this sort of dualistic impulse we have as a society. Like we think we're the ones riding around inside of our meat suit, and so
Yeah.
we have some sort of, like you call it, like privilege to understand what's going on inside, but we don't. Like
Don't.
that,
Yeah.
we can't explain. And I mean, this has been shown on a lot of psychological research, at least to my understanding. I'm not a psychologist, but
Yeah.
my understanding is it's very easy to demonstrate that people are terrible at explaining their own behavior.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
like
You can be saying something to yourself for 15 straight years, and then your therapist says, "Oh, that's about your dad," and you're like, "Oh my god, it was about my dad this whole time." Like, how can I have such privileged information and somebody else inform me about my own conscious experience? Like, how that doesn't make sense. And but we do it all the time. Even very very simple things like you can be staring directly at a painting and somebody say, "Oh, I like the bird," and you're like, "What bird?" "That bird." "Oh my god, there's a bird in this painting." How could they tell you about what you're seeing? Like, you're looking directly at it and they just told you how can it be that you have privileged information about your conscious experience and someone else can inform you what your conscious experience is? For me
that's
personally, a big one was, the first time I'm reading Daniel Kahneman, and he says, when you move, you delete the motion of your eyes, right? Like, you delete when I see a blurry footage on a
yeah.
camera moving, I'm like, it doesn't occur to me to ask, why don't my eyes do that, right? I don't think about it until I'm reading Kahneman, and he says that our brains delete that. And now I look around like, how did I not notice? How did I not notice all this time? He just told me about something that I've been seeing with my own eyes every day for 30 years. It's not,
Yeah.
it's, how can I claim to have privileged information?
No, that's the perfect example. That's hilarious. I think I've talked about this book like endlessly in these interviews, but I think it was in Robert Sapolsky's Behave, where
Oh,
he talks about. I'm sorry.
I haven't finished that one. That is a hard book.
It is big and thick, and not every page is interesting. but but
It
it's
was very interesting though.
it is very good. And
Yeah.
but he talks about in one part, I'm pretty sure it's from this book, that he compares the way Eastern and Western people look at a painting.
Mm.
And I think it's that Western people start with particular details and then move out to the whole. And Eastern people tend to appreciate the whole first and then look at details.
Okay.
And
Okay.
it's like, the would we have ever known that about our own perception without someone explaining like, oh, actually the way you even approach looking at this painting is like culturally determined or has a heavy cultural influence. And it's like,
I love that example. That's a great example. It's without your cooperation, I could not understand myself. Without your participation in the endeavor, I would not have anything to contrast against.
mhm,
And so
ab-
that's brilliant. I
absolutely.
I I found that to be true in my own life. Like in every aspect of my identity has been improved by comparing it. Not comparing might not be the best word, but by trying to communicate with other people, like with my spouse, my most intimate feelings get reflected back to me, and I don't just get, oh, that's interesting that you feel that way. I feel this way. I also get that we both have similar common experiences, and from that I learn that's not just me, that's human, right? But how could I
Mhm.
have known? How could I have known without interacting with another person that wasn't just me? And I feel like the internet gives us that all day, every day. Every meme is like, oh my
Yeah.
god, you guys go through that too.
Well, and it's like one of the things I like to bring up is like have a look at the research on feral children, right?
Yes,
It's
yes,
like look at
yes.
what happens when we don't get that stimulation from other people, or
This
when like I remember I think it was a Russian girl that like her parents, I mean this is a very like abusive situation, but her parents basically kept her in the backyard with the dogs,
Oh
and
wow.
she was socialized like as a dog, like she exhibited all these like dog behavior. She'd bark at people, she'd run around on her hands and knees and stuff, and it's like that is the putty that we are before like society shapes us. Like
Yeah,
we
yeah, it's hard to. Oh, I remember listening to an NPR thing about this, about group of people who are they don't have words, and it's that the entire group was excommunicated for being mute individually. It's just in the same way that our homeless people tend to have disabilities. um and in groups like that, if you ask them before they're taught to sign, if you ask them after the fact, what did you think? Like when you were thinking without words, what did you think? They can't put it into words. It isn't possible for us to communicate to you. And but the way that they share stories would be like acting the way that we would play charades, and it's hard. I thought that was super interesting. After the fact, when you do finally learn language, you can't communicate the way that you conceived the world before, but language gives us the ability to conceive the world in a much deeper and broader way. You couldn't tell me without language that there are people in Australia right now. You could not do it. But I can understand that the world is round, and that if I go straight down for long enough, I will run into other humans somehow. I just like it's very hard. It's very hard for you to communicate ideas like that without language. It allows us to not just perceive the outside world, like the nature of Earth, but also ourselves. Like those people without language, the girl who is raised as an animal, or the men who are excommunicated because of their inability to learn to speak. They're missing out on themselves. They're missing out on most of what they could know about themselves. And and it's hard in that light to hear somebody say that I know me and you can't make any claims about what my life is like. And it's like, no, come on, guy.
I remember reading a piece by Helen Keller that said something to the same effect, where she was talking about her experiences before she learned concepts,
There you
and it
go.
was all just kind of like this blur of like emotions, and like she
Yeah,
didn't have any way to organize like what she was feeling. And
that's the way I feel when I'm deprived of words. When I don't have access to them right now, it doesn't feel like I have a good handle on what I'm doing, or what I'm thinking, or even how I'm feeling. The way that I'm feeling, as soon as you give me words to express the way that I'm feeling, I have a lot more control over how I react to my feelings.
mhm,
Like you point out to me that that's not just despair, that there's some anger in there, and now all of a sudden I have the ability to better manage my own emotional state. And it is really just understanding it that gives it to me. And I can't get that without words. I can't. I'm not saying that there's no knowledge without,
Right.
but it's much weaker. It is much less capable.
Man, that's some deep shit.
I,
Uh,
I think about that. I think about that Helen Keller situation a lot. Like if you had never if you had never taught Helen Keller how to speak, if it wasn't possible for us to tap somebody's arm and teach them words, then they would never know that they were a part of a world. They would never know that they were a human being. They would never know that 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 their breath isn't like the wind. You know, that there are different things going on here.
yeah, I think it'd be a very like messy, confusing experience.
Yeah, yes. It's I I feel very fortunate to get to think with you guys. You know?
That's awesome. I like it. I like it. So yeah, I think we've almost hit everything that I got these questions on the side over here, and I think we've pretty much just ran over all of them. I think it's great.
The social implications.
Yeah,
People tend to talk about the medicalization of the criminal justice system, which
yeah,
is definitely an inevitable byproduct of giving up free will. But I think you and I did a good job of talking about the more positive aspect of trying to build a world where people make better decisions. And if you talk about that first, it kind of makes the criminal justice conversation unnecessary, because it's you know it's inevitable that if we produce better incentives to make people want to be better people, the problem of criminality takes care of itself.
yeah. I think it's just a piece of like how to create more well-being in
Yeah,
society, and
yeah,
the more we do that, and the more like preventative we are about people's behavior, then the less we have to deal with the shittier parts of it that are unpleasant or uh yeah, or concerning. And yeah, I don't know. um
well,
I oh
um
Go ahead.
okay, go ahead. No. You have any questions?
Oh, I was just gonna say, I feel like we've kind of hit on everything. So I wanted to ask if there's just like some things you felt like we missed out on, or some things you'd like to bring up.
um I don't know if it's in this video, but if we at some point, I'd like to talk about the Black universe and many worlds versus presentism, and like where I think the reason I think that people struggle with compatible people like Daniel Dennett struggle with compatibilism. You know, there's when you talk to someone who's just a pure Newtonian, you eventually run into this problem that there's no such thing as possibility, right?
Huh.
There's
Yeah.
just what is, and not only could none of us have done differently, but nothing could happen differently. It is going to be what it is. And so it doesn't make sense to say that somebody should do something, or that something could have been, or something or even future ones start to become impossible. It's easier to hide there because of our ignorance, but they start to become impossible to have basic conversations well, we could do this. In a real sense, we can't, like, but that's only true if you take the Newtonian view. If you incorporate the our understanding of quantum mechanics, we end up with either it's indeterministic, right? And in which case it could happen, like it could be, and it could have been, and should totally is an accessible word, or we get the many worlds interpretation, in which case there's a number of outcomes that's possible from our given circumstance, and that number can be smaller or greater. If I'm about to enter into a black hole, there are fewer possible outcomes from where I'm standing than if I'm about to press enter to turn my computer on. right? In a similar way, there's fewer outcomes from where I'm standing if I'm say about to, I don't know, talk to a stranger than if I'm about to talk to my spouse. Now, it's not that there's the difference in number is as big as fall into a black hole or turn on the internet, but there is a difference, and that means that we can grow in ability, right? I can have more freedom than I had before in the sense that I have more available futures. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think so. Yeah. Um, that's an interesting thought. I don't know what to do with it, but
Like I I run into a lot of people who say, where does all the energy for other worlds come from? Or I run into people who say, why assume so many extra variables? Well, one, it's one extra variable. If this is a full graph, you added X, Y, Z, and T, and now there's T2. Like it's not as if I'm adding and making this conversation infinitely more complex. So like
right,
nobody says that by saying that there's a height dimension as well as width and depth, that we're adding infinite variables to the system. Nobody says that. It's just like we should ignore height because that's adding too many possible states of being. But it's really just as infinite an addition as adding an extra t coordinate. Well, anyway, I think Daniel Dennett is trying to save the idea of freedom, right? Of ability, of power. And it doesn't make sense to say that a slave has just as much freedom as a person who owns the slave. It doesn't make as much sense to say that a person denied of their education has as much freedom as a person who goes to Oxford. It doesn't make sense. But in a deterministic way, those statements are true. And if we there are other physical models of the universe that save ability, that save power, that they account for these differences. And I don't think that linear model, that presentist Newtonian, there's only the now, the past doesn't exist anymore, the future doesn't exist yet. I don't think that model of the world is coherent. First of all, not everything that exists now is physically embodied. There are potential energies in the present. How do you account for them? Where are they?
right.
Well, in a real sense, all energies are potential energies. Our mass is a potential energy. Our kinetic motion is a potential energy. If we freeze the frame of our universe, we don't end up with a picture of energies. We don't end up with a picture of momentum. We don't end up with a picture of gravity. We end up with this still image of the universe that has no relationships, right? There's no relationship between past and future events because there is no embodied past and there is no embodied future yet, right? I don't think that that's a coherent image. It seems to me to be immediately self-contradictory, and it can't account for everything that we see.
Yeah, I
Well,
agree.
that's if you accept that the past and the future are real, then that eliminates all the problems with potential energies, right? They're relationships between events now and events in the past that are fixed, right? Or they're relationships between events in the future and events now that are fixed. They make sense in the idea that, in the sense that if I know that 7 plus x is 10, I know that x is 3, right? It's not that x is the 7 causes the x to be 3. It's that if the one is this, the other has to be this. There's a set proportionality to all the variables in the universe, and they must be in relation to each other to sum to this one total. The total charge in the universe is 0, or the total amount of the energy in the universe is the same. Which may or may not be true. Inflation is weird, but I mean, that's weird. Anyway,
Yeah, no, true. Yeah,
I I I don't think it makes sense to say that 7 causes x to be 3 in this equation, 7 plus x equals 10. It's that x must be 3 because the equation will always add up to this.
it's
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 not.
like more mutual than directional, maybe.
they're they're they in order for, if you are, it's true in the same way that if I go up, there's now more space below me. It isn't that when I went up, it caused there to be more space. That space didn't suddenly come into being.
Yeah.
It must be true. There is a set proportionality. Well, anyway, I think that we end up with a picture of the universe in which we are fated, but our fates are much bigger than we could ever possibly conceive. You
Hmm.
know.
So that's interesting. So that would be like some type of fatalism, but like a very like broad type, or so, or like how would you describe
I
that?
struggle with that too. I usually say that we are fatalists. I usually say that I'm a fatalist, but it doesn't. It is. I don't get the conclusion that other fatalists get because of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. I don't. It doesn't make sense to claim that I will become one of these futures. All of those futures share this past. Like all of those futures from this moment will all remember being me. So in a sense, I am each of them. I don't get to experience at the same time being all of them because it's impossible. But but I have all of those fates. You know, they must occur, and I'm going to be in them. And I don't. And they are both simultaneously fixed, and I'm only going to get to be one. I'm only going to get to experience being one. Does that make sense?
Interesting. Interesting.
Mm.
I think I follow. So that's
Well,
pretty abstract.
I well, I don't follow with the physicists who say Sabine Hofstadter, is that
Sure,
her name?
yeah.
She says I'm an instrumentalist. You know, I don't believe that the quantum mechanical rules really represent reality. They just make good predictions. And I'm like, but she also claims that there's no free will because the physical rules represent reality and they make accurate predictions. So it's like that's a self-contradictory position to take.
Yeah, I don't know how that squares.
I don't mean either, but I think that I get what they're saying. We can't measure superposition. We can
Hmm.
show that superposition exists because it self interacts in a way to produce the reality that we have, right? But it doesn't. We only ever measure things at fixed points and derive that superposition exists from the way that those fixed points come about. And it's impossible to measure that superposition exists. Well, that for some people is enough to say no. Like me and Trick Slatery get into that argument all the time. That is enough for some people to say it isn't worth thinking about. If you can't ever measure it, it isn't worth thinking about. Well, I can't measure that light moves away from the earth in straight lines, but it's worth thinking about. You know, I will never catch that light. It's moving at light speed. I can't prove that it's there, but I definitely believe that it's there. You know, it doesn't make sense to me that the light could travel in that straight path, hit the earth, rebound off earth, go into space at a random direction, and then cease to exist, right? Why should I just assume that it's not real because I can't ever catch it? Well, in the
Yeah.
same all of these probability waves are moving in their directions, and we can measure where they self interact to produce our world at where they're touching, and predicting the directions that they move will always give us the most accurate human predictions known to man. And all I'm saying is that when they're not here, they keep moving in the way that they were, right? The geometry is true whether we're standing there or not. And if that's I don't think that that's a huge leap in logic. I don't think that I'm drawing anything crazy in it. Like superposition isn't something that we came up with. And if you really think it's real in the world, we end up with multiverse. And if you don't think it's real, you end up with the Copenhagen interpretation where it collapses, but we can't ever measure collapse and we can't tell you why it happens or where the energy goes, and we can't develop linear explanations for what would cause the collapse. They're the arg. There are these experiments that we can do where we can show that the thing propagates as the probability wave until the point of interaction, and we can put the point of interaction after something else would have impeded it. So we can put the point of interaction before or after the double slits, right? And it's going to move through them. And if it goes through, we put it before the double slits, that point of interaction will always show the one wave. and we point after those slits, it will always be predictable as if there were two waves moving out from the slit, right? So how could it be that that superposition doesn't exist and it causes this collapse to behave differently in those two different circumstances? How can it be that it's not real and it has a real effect? I don't, and that's not like quantum eraser experiments are more complicated, but I think they're even more definitive. Like you cannot account for the sequence of events without reversing the order of time somehow. That like the interaction at the end of time directed how this particle was going to move 13 billion years ago. I don't see how we can.
What kind of universe is that?
Right. And some people will say that that makes more sense, that that's more coherent than just adding an extra variable to our geometry. It's just one more coordinate value, you know. And I don't see that. That doesn't make sense to me. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about this stuff. I don't think I have an opinion. Like
No,
like it's
okay. I have a friend Levi who asked me to make sure that I talked about many worlds, the many
oh
worlds,
cool.
because all of the videos that we watched together, nobody talked about anything except the regular Newtonian view of physics, right?
Yeah.
And the many worlds interpretation gives us a different picture of what it means to act, like how causality evolves. It turns out that every possible way for two particles to interact is accounted for, and we must in Feynman's sum over worlds model of predicting quantum interactions, we must account for every possible way that the particles could behave. And it just turns out that because of their proximity, there are more ways, just very slightly more ways for it to behave in our predictable, the way that we would intuit, than there are in the ways that we wouldn't intuit. And we happen to be orders of magnitude removed from this process. Like we happen to be on this between that scale and black holes right in the middle, you know? And the fact that we only see things behaving in this classical Newtonian way is a statistical fact. There's an average of all of the ways that it could behave, and we are so far removed that we're not going to see the statistically anomalous ones. You know, we're going to never see. We call it the principle of least action, but in reality, that's just the average of all possible outcomes. And we are seeing billions and billions of dice rolls and thinking it's only one. You know, we're thinking there's only one die being rolled to determine whether what angle this ball rolls down the hill. And in reality, it's billions and billions and billions of them. And the average of them comes out to the principle of least action, but doesn't guarantee at any one single interaction that that's going to happen. As a matter of fact, it's very unlikely to happen if we only use two particles. If we only use two particles, all of a sudden, the chances of us hitting the principle of least action are slim to none. And that means that things like causality as we normally see it are aggregate average effects, and that in actuality, everything that could happen does happen. And we are so far removed. We are so many stages. The scale is at such a small level compared to us that we only see the average. And to us, that means that it's always the same, and that's not true. It's just simply not true. Particles in a vacuum will not always increase the entropy. They will most of the time increase in entropy because there's way more ways for them to do so. If I take every possible way that a system could evolve and I count them all up, there are more ways that it can become entropic than less entropic, simply because being less entropic means that there's fewer arrangements. There are fewer changed variables in the arrangements. Why is the universe at the very beginning a singularity? Well, if we put everything in one place, there are very few ways to arrange it. There must be more order in the past than in the future, and that will stay true. But that doesn't mean that entropy is a law of the universe. It means that it's a statistical aggregate. It is an average. It is the most likely thing to happen from any 2 points. If I take two objects, you know, there are infinitely more paths for them to move away from each other than toward each other. That doesn't mean that there are none. and that they can't move toward each other, it means that if I flip the coin, if I play the script a million times, I'm very likely I'm very unlikely to see them come together then move apart. But on a long enough time scale, that's what we will see. And that view is a coherent view of reality. We end up with a view of reality that accounts for why there is lower entropy in the past and higher entropy in the future. We end up with a view of reality that accounts for reality existing at all. You know, why is it here? Like, how can, in the Newtonian sense, how can a lower entropy state come into being? Why was there a beginning at all? You know,
Right.
for me, self-consistency is a much more important part of a theory than its, what's the word that Slater uses all the time? It's how few things it assumes. There's a word for it. It starts with a P.
Is it parody?
Not quite parody.
Uh,
Parody is like how closely it matches something else. It's like anyway, I don't think that it's more important for a theory to assume fewer objects than it is for it to be self-consistent. Like, as soon as it becomes self-contradictory, that is immediately an indication that it's not correct. This isn't true. There's something wrong with it. And the Newtonian view of reality is immediately self-contradictory. That's not even counting that, like, the past and the future must exist. You know, that we just talked about Richard Feynman and quantum mechanics, but like Einstein pretty clearly demonstrates that the past and the future are directions, that they're not that time and space are unified, that we're not, there's not just a present moment. And I don't think that most people who have this conversation about free will are entirely caught up in that subject. I mean, in the last century's scientific gains, you know,
right.
if our past always exists and our future already exists, then we for sure cannot be free. And I don't see how the world can be any other way. It doesn't make sense to me that there are truths about the past and the past isn't there. And it doesn't make sense to me that the future is, that there is a future and it has no properties. You know, like, how can it be? How can it be and have zero properties?
Yeah. So so fundamentally, is this like a probabilistic way of looking at the world?
Well, if it's probabilistic if you take if you just take Newtonian mechanics and ignore relativity, right? But
Okay.
if you add in relativity, we end up with a many worlds interpretation that doesn't grow. It is a block universe where every possible life is represented in relation to, defined in relation to each other. There's one single wave function that self-interacts to produce, as we say self-interacts, but it takes every possible form that it could, and both the past and the future are, and every possible, we say present, but it's not really, what we call present in time is what we call here in space. You know, they're the same idea. There's not a privileged here in the universe. If it's not probabilistic if you account for relativity, it is probabilistic if you don't. If you don't, we can't know what the future was, and we really can't perfectly retrodict the past with quantum mechanics either. But if you take relativity into account, the new worlds aren't made. They don't come into being. The reality doesn't branch at that point. It already was split, and there's no intrinsic motion to time itself. Rather, we experience time. We experienced our ignorance changing. The what we call change is each instance of us, comic book style, seeing our past ignorance in a different light to each other. So we can kind of see that the illusion of change arises from inside of us when we look at a comic book and infer actions between the images. You know, we don't have to actually experience change. We just need to experience difference to infer change. And we don't ever in the real world experience change. We only ever measure differences and infer change. Well, if we drop that word change and just keep differences, we can have our 5D view of space-time and it doesn't have any self-contradictions anymore. I can't refer to a thing that doesn't exist. It's impossible for me to say, well, they're just theoretical objects in my head. Really, they're only actual objects, and I'm better and worse at describing them. They're really, there's no there's no separation between a concept and its thing. So you say, sometimes people will say, well, there are things that exist in our head that are true but have no embodiment. What? Well, 2 + 2 = 4. Well, there's never a time where 2 + 2 = 4 isn't instantiated anywhere, and you don't know it through anything except how you encounter it in the physical world. Like, you couldn't know that 2 + 2 = 4 if you never counted things.
Yeah.
And it is embodied in the world. And they say, well, President Abraham Lincoln was the president of the United States. That's no longer embodied in the world, and that's a fact. It's like, actually, it is. The past is still there, and Abraham Lincoln is still watching the theater, not knowing that John Wilkes Booth is walking around. And we can eliminate all of those problems with the conflict between form and substance by just accepting that the past and future exist. There's no such thing as an unembodied form.
Trippy. That's what I have to offer. Yeah, no, I don't know what I think about that stuff.
I don't know if it's relevant to your podcast. It's relevant to no free will for me, but since most people don't think about free will in terms of the physics itself, but how they experience making decisions. And I don't know that it's going to be helpful to people to think about many worlds and stuff, and to understand. I don't think that. If anything, it makes it less comprehensible.
I think. Well, what I can definitely say is, like, I appreciate knowing the different ways that people like arrive at these positions, and that is. Without a doubt, that's valuable to someone, right? Maybe that's
Yeah,
not like the most popular, most accessible way of getting from point A to point B, but it's
my friend Levi, he personally took a lot of interest in it. And after we started, he's a historian, so he has always been running into the problem that people say that the past doesn't exist anymore, and and he's like, how I can't reconcile my idea that what is true is always true, with this idea that the past ceases to exist. And for him, block universe was also, he argues against theism a lot. So if you do that, then you'll find that people retreat inside of causality, or they'll retreat inside of this atemporality that the now has. There's only the now, and what the future doesn't exist yet, and the past doesn't exist anymore, and this is all we ever have. And in my personal subjective experience, there is a thing that's engaging with me at the spiritual level. And you say, well, okay, but your now is 30 seconds late, and if we try to time it,
right.
You're never ever going to be able to actually hit a clock as the bullet strikes the screen, or as the light flashes. We will always have, like, your now is late, and it's not always equally late.
Yeah, you would always be in the past if that's
yes,
true. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that it struck a chord with him, one, because that's his college major, but also because arguing with I want to say anti-science folks, there's a lot of appeals to the non-existence of the rest of time. The only reality is my own subjective experience right here, and everything else may or may not be true, but I can only encounter it through this lens. And so this lens is what is primarily real.
what do you call, like, solipsism, or however it's pronounced? Like
it is solipsism.
Yeah, solipsism.
I compare presentism to solipsism in time. Only my now is real. Your now is not real. My now is real.
Aren't you lucky? Yeah.
I don't know if it's a defensible position to take, and I try really hard to talk to people about it, and they blow up. People really blow up when you tell them that there are other nows. There's no reason to consider that your own frame of reference. Like you don't have to take my word on it. If you look up if you just watch a YouTube video on the relativity of simultaneity, if you accounting for the fact that time dilates, if I travel in a distance and you travel in a distance in the opposite direction, either toward or away from each other, and there's another set of events that are occurring real close together, we won't agree on the order of events, right?
Mm-hmm.
To one observer, they'll be past or future relative to each other, and to the other, it'll be the opposite. And how can that be? How can that be? How is it possible for there to be different orders of past and future for different observers, and there's still only one present moment?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make sense to me. But while it's possible for you to reach relativity with like algebra 2, it's possible for you to graph it. All you have to take on faith is that the speed of light is constant for all observers. If you don't want to take that on faith, you can prove it to yourself. It's just much more difficult than the rest of the work. But when you account for the speed of light being the same for all observers, and you try to graph the motion of observers in a 3D space, you will never end up with a universal simultaneity. You will never end up with an agreed upon present moment for all observers. And so why is it that physically in space, there are different present moments, and yet we as individuals only accept our now as real?
It seems rather naive.
Yeah. I don't see how. Well, for me, it pushes me into this block universe perspective where all of time is embodied. And then for a long time, that was it. Like I didn't have anything extra. I think Kurt Vonnegut pushed me in that direction, and I had a bunch of questions about it. And I started reading books about Einstein, and I'm really glad that happened to me, and it made for interesting stuff. It's hard to deal with sometimes. I didn't have an entirely happy life, so it's hard for me to picture my 10-year-old self still going through those things right now, unescapable. But I get little solaces, like if he knew that I could see him right now, if he knew that I could see him right now and knew how I felt about it, he would feel a lot better. I don't know. It gives me new, different emotional quandaries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You definitely now you're like exploring all these different perspectives that you would usually exclude from your process.
They're not real anymore, right? It doesn't exist. Well, there's problems with that view. How does nothingness exist? Like how if everything goes to nothingness behind us, how does it have properties? How did it generate the now?
Yeah. Like is that a concept that actually corresponds to something?
Yeah. Is there really another, like when people talk about nothing, they'll say, I have 3 apples and I give somebody else 3 apples, and so I have no apples. There's nothing in my hands. And there's not literally nothing in your hand. You didn't open a black hole in the room. Hey, do you guys want an apple? Oh my God, my house. That never happens.
Yeah.
What we're talking about when we talk about nothingness is non-identity. This thing has this identity, and because of that, it doesn't have these identities. But we're never actually talking about nothingness itself, which as an idea doesn't make sense. I mean, like it doesn't. It exists and it has no properties. Existence is a property, how does non-existence have the property of existing? Where would you put it? Places or things?
Where would you put it? Yeah, I feel similarly about like we mentioned earlier about like randomness, as
Yes.
I'm not sure I'm saying something that's intelligible or real when I say randomness.
Exactly.
But I'm also not sure I'm not. Like I feel very agnostic about it.
Well, I don't feel agnostic about nothingness. I am a firm disbeliever in the existence of nothingness. I don't think that it's like
I do not believe in nothing. I promise.
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm agnostic about free will. It's just, no one can give me a coherent description of it, you know?
Right.
And in the same way, no one can give me a coherent description of nothingness. They can only refer to something. Not something. You know, okay, thanks. It's helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we have like this intuition that if you can say one thing, you can say its opposite. And
Right.
so
Right.
and so if there's an existence, there must be like a non-existence. And it's like, well,
That and
I don't know
I,
if that follows. I don't know if I can wrap my head around that.
opposites are usually unified so that they can each be described as one thing. Like, if I say north, and the south, the opposite south is doing the same thing. There's nothing in south that the northness doesn't have, and one can become the other depending on which way that I want to face. You know, if
Right.
I we had chosen to, we didn't have to name the electron the electron. We could have named it the positron. It doesn't change the function of the thing. There is a shared, there is a sine wave that is down or it is up, and it's like down and up depending on where you're standing. You know, there's never gonna be, there's never going to be a a an opposite that isn't identical in symmetry to its opposite. You know, it is granted the identity is flipped, but they are symmetrical. But nothingness and somethingness are not. They're not. There's a perfect asymmetry there, and it doesn't. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me that we can derive the opposite of something without being able to conceptualize it. Like, it doesn't make sense to me that we can conceptualize down, you know,
Yeah.
it doesn't take much for me to flip the arrow, you know, and I even for things that are impossible, like traveling back into the past, it doesn't take much for me to flip the arrow of time. It's literally impossible for me to flip the arrow of being,
Of,
you
of existence.
know? Right.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those like uh I think it's like a linguistic operation that we like intuitively expect to work, and it doesn't really.
No, it does.
Like it's
It does. There's a lot of there are problems that philosophers have been saying about it since Parmenides says, "From nothing comes nothing." You know, if it has no property, it doesn't have the property of potential to make being. You know,
hmm
where is where is the? But my thing is, in this new world, we know that time and space are things that they're not fixed properties in the background. They can
hmm
be affected and they can be changed. So time and space being things means that there's no place to put nothing. There's no
I love that phrase.
so I don't know. I feel like that's an incoherent concept, and presentism relies on it. The future is nothing right now, you know, although it exists somehow. It exists in a sense. We know that we have futures, but they don't have any
Yeah.
properties, and there's nothing that can be said about them because they don't exist yet. What does it mean to be true that it's there and it doesn't exist yet? That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I
Um,
don't know, man. You got my head going in circles now. I don't know.
I'm really not trying to wear on this topic. I personally find it in inspirational. It makes me think about a lot of stuff.
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate like the exercise, like going through it, and it it does I think this is part of the problem, is that we don't really have intuitions with regard to like how the world actually works. We have intuitions based on our experiences and our
Yeah,
access to information,
we
and
want
like
obviously the world as it is, but to make use of what we had access to.
right, right. And like of course our sensory information and stuff is like shaped by like the necessity of the moment and things like that. And so like yeah, when you start talking about like large like ultimate subjects, like like the
Yeah,
singularity that started everything off, it's like yeah, I have no intuition for that. And
we
personally, oh, go ahead.
we just have to try to extrapolate from the known. You know,
Right.
like we're really lucky. We're really lucky that the universe is a composite, right? So as we at this broader level where things are made out of things, we can make the mistake as we start of calling them unified. I am me. I'm not made of parts. Well, over time, we must see that they're made of parts in order to things being made of simpler things.
Oh
We
shit.
also increase in
You
universality.
you cut out for about 10 seconds.
Oh, sorry, that's okay. I'm on my data connection. As we see that complex things are made out of simpler things, we don't just get more parts, we get more universal parts, right? So that the number of objects in the universe that's made out of organic material is small, but the number that are made out of atoms is much, much larger. The number that are made out of particles is even larger than that, and the number that are made out of fields is assumably infinite, is the whole thing, right? So we're fortunate to be able to understand a greater and greater volume of the universe by understanding what we have right in front of us better. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I follow.
So we don't just get complex things are made out of simpler things. We get complex things are made out of simpler, more universal things. That's what allows us to extrapolate back to the Big Bang and to large ideas like being. And it doesn't mean that we're, just because we're trapped to our sensory data doesn't mean that we cannot explore the greater universe. You know, I can learn about
Right.
Australia.
Yeah, no, true. True. Except for Australia is a myth and a
Oh, no.
conspiracy.
Birds aren't real. What are you talking
Birds aren't real. They're just government drones.
I
No, no, no,
just
no.
about,
I don't mean to dumb up the conversation. That's
about that yesterday because I was so inspired by the people trying to melt snow with their lighter. Um, I says,
snow isn't real.
isn't it interesting that that they could not have said that before? It couldn't be like, if we go back 1,000 years, nobody could have said they're making fake snow. It's only now that we have the ability to mass produce enough plastic to cover the surface of the planet and smother ourselves that we're like, oh yeah, the snow could be fake, you know. And it's scary that when we increase our powers, we at the same time increase our ability to be skeptical about mundane things. You know,
Right.
it wasn't until we start making computer programs that people are like, oh, the Matrix, you know. And in the same way, it isn't until we can make all this plastic that people or robots, you know, flying robots that people are like, oh, birds are fake. Well, my big concern is that when we make bioengineered animals, we will people will start there'll be a growing portion of the population that claims that animals never existed and they were made up by scientists to prove evolution, you know. And I was like, no. In advance.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if there's really a limit to like how far we can go down those rabbit holes. Like I feel
I
like
mean,
we're
directly inverse to our power. It's like how skeptical we can be is
right.
related to how much we can affect the world.
Right. Although I would say you do have like very old religions that were like skeptical of immediate
Yeah,
experience and ultimate reality and things like that. But
it's,
I think
I think those people are piggybacking off of dreams to some regard. You know,
that's
like
interesting.
well, if you fall asleep, we all have had the experience of not knowing we were in a dream, and it would be really hard for me as an ancient person to not wonder if reality was somebody's dream. You know,
Yeah.
that's not a real big leap. It's still a human ability that we're superimposing onto the world, just not one that we made, one that we inherited.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, like Maya as like the illusion of reality or something. Yeah, it's very much very similar to like a dream.
Yeah, or a hallucination or something. It's those are still human powers, and I don't see that question would have been avoidable. You know, like I can't foresee, I couldn't picture myself as a person like spending their whole life fishing in the ocean and not wondering, am I asleep right now? You know, like
At
I
some
don't see
point.
that.
Yeah,
Well,
it seems like it would pop up at some point.
yeah, yeah. Well, I really like this conversation. It was fun talking to you.
Yeah, man, it was good to get to know you better. That's been one of my favorite parts of this whole thing is like actually putting like names and faces and ideas all together. That's been interesting.
It's easier for us to have I don't know. I have this tendency to be as concise as possible in text. I try
Mhm.
as super hard, but it makes me come out much more blunt and argumentative than I really mean to be. I'm just trying to curtail my own tendency to run on and on. You know?
I think that's all of us, and honestly, I think text only communication is like really problematic in and of itself. It's like very artificial. I've and there's like really interesting differences that you get between like you know, non-literate or pre-literate societies and literate societies. Like text in general is like this really interesting question about how it affects our thought process. And I don't, yeah, I'm,
It reminds me of Socrates. You know, there's all these people in their books. They're losing their memories.
I definitely look forward to someday in the future where internet communication is not so heavily based on text. And
Yeah,
I think like coronavirus has advanced a lot of that because a lot more people are doing video chats because they have no
and
choice.
have you read when I read science fiction about the future, there's usually the internet is usually like a place you walk around in. You know, it's not like
Right.
a thing that we look at or read about. It's not a newspaper that we open in our screens. It's like a place that we go to, that we visit. And the only reason we can't do that right now is that the virtual reality isn't there. But I mean, it's gonna get there. There's how long do you think we're really gonna have before you can wear contacts that let you surf the internet from your desk? You know,
Oh
it's not.
yeah.
It's it in that world. We will walk around and talk to each other online. I went to my friend's house and he has his whole living room set up to be a VR thing for his Oculus, and they're like infrared cameras. So it's weird for me. I didn't even know he was home. You know, it's pitch black in his house, and he's but he's just standing around in the darks playing on the internet on his game. And when I went to play with him, I also put on a headset. It wasn't like he handed me his. I put on a headset, and suddenly I was where he was, and it felt like we were in a different place, and I was no longer standing in somebody's dark living room with no furniture. It's like it's like I don't know. It felt like being privy to the future. It felt like getting a glimpse of what my kids are gonna grow up in.
I think I think in like with that sort of technology, we have like the radical potential for reimagining social organization.
Yes.
And this is one of the things that excites me the most. And yeah, I think there's like all these like really practical problems that are very difficult to sort out in like, you know, meet space or whatever, IRL.
That
Um,
meat space versus think space.
yeah, and I think if you're literally in this like infinite world where like, you know, things like you know, material can be conjured and whatnot. I mean, it's basically a magical space. Like, um, I I don't know. I think there's a lot of problem solving that can happen in this space that can be like pulled back into, you know, our everyday lives.
Well, think
That
about how safe person to person interactions are. So like if you have post traumatic stress disorder, and it can be really hard for you to feel comfortable standing in a room with another person, but
mhm,
virtual reality makes it possible for you to be in a room with 50 people and know that they can't touch you. You know, like
right.
one of these
Yeah.
people right now, I'm sitting on my couch, and it can be a good bridge for people who are otherwise trapped. Like there's some really large portion of Japan that never leaves their apartments. Those people don't have to be trapped. They can experience a bigger and broader world, even a more universal context. One that's like my friend Lee says that he doesn't identify as a citizen of the United States. He identifies as a citizen of the internet. You know, and it's
Cool.
like as the future, that's probably going to become a much more common sentiment.
Well, that's really, yeah, when we're talking about like a whole different like energy grid, a whole different communication, like this virtual landscape that we all might live within, like, yeah, like I think ultimately a lot of the like Yuval Harari would say, like a lot of the sort of social fictions that got us to this point, they don't matter as much. And like we'll probably create, you know, new social fictions, hopefully
Yeah,
that are based more on our real situation in the biosphere rather
I
than
like that way of trying to tackle problems too, trying to make them entirely obsolete, just difficult to even continue to have the conversation in that light by
right.
changing the circumstances in which we do it. You know, it's
Yeah,
just,
I like
I
it.
I'm hoping I'd like that. I really liked Harari's book, Sapiens. I didn't like Homo Deus as much, and people call me a futurist. You know, I just like talking about what the technology is going to be like. I'm not trying to add a timeline or anything,
Right.
but uh, the the Homo Deus I didn't find anywhere near as interesting as Sapiens, and that's weird because Sapiens is all about the past. Although Sapiens ends on a super great question. He says, "What do we want to want?" And I've thought about that a lot. Have you ever read uh, "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep"?
I know of it, but I don't think I've ever sat down and read. I've not read, that's Philip K. Dick, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I think I read one book that a friend of mine gave me, and it was not that one. I forget what the title was, but
Well, I read I think all of Philip K. Dick stuff. I'm a huge science fiction fan, and like I said, I grew up needing glasses and not having them, so I read a lot as a little kid, and science fiction is like the go-to. And well, Philip K. Dick opens that book on a scene where a man and his wife are arguing, and they're arguing over whether or not she should choose to be happy. Right, there's a machine sitting on their nightstand, and they can roll a Rolodex because we can only predict some technologies. Um, they roll a Rolodex and find the number and dial it into the machine, and it emits a radio signal that changes your brain waves to cause you to feel. And whether or not that's how that machine would work in the future, this is what drugs are for. That's why we chemically change ourselves. One day, as we grow the ability to do so, this will become more plausible. Anyway, so he says, if you're so miserable, why don't you just dial happiness? And she's like, I don't want to dial happiness where I am. He's like, well, I'll dial it for you. She's like, no, I don't want you to dial happiness where I am. And he's like, but you will after I dial it. He's like, but that's not who I am right now. And this person, and in a real sense, that's the struggle that we're having on a day-to-day basis. Like, we don't have to put a machine in to affect our feelings for all of us to be struggling every day to decide if we want to feel better in the holistic sense, or if this person that I am right now wants to feel better. Like, that's really every person everywhere all the time. Well, anyway, in the scene, he ends up dialing like unadulterated love for your spouse, and then they spend she's like, just dial anything. I just don't want to talk about it. Well, I don't know. I've thought about that idea ever since, and in a more personal sense, it would be nice to be able to have a set of dials that are all of my emotions that are in conflict at any given time, and just turn them up and turn them down. It would be really nice. I don't want to be so anxious right now. I have to keep working. It's not going to do me any good. And I think that we will get the power to do that, and it will make our conversations about free will much more difficult to have. Not that it will change the nature of the conversation. For sure, just like when you choose to move your hand, there are causes that cause you to do that. But right now we say, I want to do this, and I can't choose what I want. Well, one day that's not going to be true, and it's going to make this conversation even harder.
People will be like, look at me exercising my free will right now. Happy, sad, happy, sad. Like,
You're really moving the dial that's making you do things.
yeah, yeah, no, that it's interesting because that is like kind of a sticking point at the moment, is that like you can't choose what you choose.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
everyone knows the feeling of making a choice, but no one really knows like the feeling
How
of like setting their desires. Like,
Well, one day we will be able to pick what our desires are, and like in some sense we can already do it. I can self-medicate, or I can sit down and meditate on a goal that I have or something. And so there are ways that we can very in very small ways we can affect our desires, but in the future we will be able to just choose, and we're going to run into all the problems that people have today thinking about, like AI, how to make the right value structure. What is a sustainable value structure? We don't have to
Mhm.
ask that question right now because we don't get to pick our values. We inherited a somewhat sustainable value structure
I,
because the people
I
who have said.
I still want us to ask that question.
I do too. Yes.
I'm like begging us, like, please, before we kill ourselves, like, let's figure this out. But no,
well, well,
I know what you mean.
yeah, yes, yeah. Well, for sure, that's relevant as hell. If you didn't, I would be surprised that you could make that comment. There's some set of values that is best for producing value itself, and whether or not we find it, that's gonna take over the universe. Does that make sense?
I think so. It cut out for like half a second there,
I'm sorry.
but you
There
were
is
saying like there's a set of values that maximizes value itself.
Yes, and whether we find it or whether something else finds it, that set of values is going to be the one that propagates.
Yeah, I
Um,
think there's definitely something to that.
I personally don't want to be um, a memory of a failed value system.
That doesn't sound fulfilling.
No, no, and like a failure in terms of satisfying value is failure to be a happy person. They're one and the same. you
Hmm.
know to live an unhappy life and to fail to sustainably meet your own values are identical. There's any discrepancy you find will be about our ability and not about the goal. Like
Hmm.
we have the evolutionary source of value is sustainability, and any creature that deviates from that process will cease to be represented in nature. And it I don't personally identify solely with the values that I have right now, and I don't think anyone does. I don't think anyone in the whole universe identifies with just the values that they have in this moment. That would be like not identifying with other emotional states. When your emotional state changes, your whole value system changes
Right.
proportional. So when I'm angry, I don't care as much about your feelings as I do when I it's not that I don't think that I should, it's that I am incapable of it right then, because that's what an emotion does, is it temporarily adjusts up and down
Right.
the my values of things. And I don't disidentify with my angry self. I just don't prioritize him. I don't he still is me, and if I chose to ignore that he was me, I would suffer for it. I would.
Yeah, that would be to your detriment.
Yeah, I poorly anticipate myself. And so how no one in the world identifies with only the wants or goals, however you want to put it, that you have right now. We actually identify with this, not just the goals that we've experienced in our lives, but even this nebulous set of goals that we've never yet experienced. We all understand that we could have wants or desires or emotional states that we've not yet had. They could be great for us or could be bad for us, but they are nonetheless us. They're just us in a setting that we haven't experienced yet.
Yeah, I mean, assumedly you're going to develop to be like a different person in the future.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you accept that that's true, then the argument that nobody can tell you what goals you should have doesn't make sense. Because we're always measuring which goals we should have right now. Like we're always comparing our priorities in different emotional states or in different contexts to decide which context or which emotional state we want to achieve. Like it's
And
impossible to avoid the question.
it relates back to that idea that like we have like this privileged position inside of ourselves that like
Yes, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah,
This
and
is
that doesn't make sense.
no No, it doesn't. It doesn't. And but people say, what if this person is, say, suicidal or whatever? They don't want to exist in the world, and you say, well, they should want to exist. And just, well, who are you to say that they should? Maybe their suffering is so bad. And it's like, well, no, they shouldn't suffer. It's you shouldn't want to exist if you're suffering. Like if we all wanted to suffer to maximal ability, we would all cease to exist anyway. It doesn't solve itself. So we what I'm not saying that everyone should want to live in all conditions. I'm saying everyone should want to live in conditions that would make them want to live.
Right.
Those,
Yeah.
those, those different statements. When I talk to people about this is-ought divide, I always get accused of claiming that I'm telling people that they're not allowed to opt out of life if it's really bad. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that if we have the ability to make life not bad for that person, we should. It's like, sometimes in that position, somebody will say, well, this is my genuine me, and if you edited my desires to be different, that would be a less genuine me. That's exactly what we're claiming, that you don't have a privileged genuine version of you.
Yeah, I don't know that genuine means anything there.
Exactly.
I think it's just a way of saying like I'm right.
Yeah. Who are you to tell me what I should want? Well, the only reason that you can say that right now is because we can't make you want. But in the future, we will gain the power to force each other to desire, not just to do, but to want to do. And in that world, we should make people want to not suffer. We should do it. We should do it.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And this is, there was a big long thread in the Reasonably group that I was kind of trying to work through some of this stuff myself, and everyone was like being real nice to me and like placating my ignorance. And, but yeah, I can't escape that thought that it really does seem that there are maybe not like absolute right and wrong moves we can make, but it does seem that like there's poles and there's like positive and negative,
Right. They're
and
better
it's
and worse ways to be. And
yeah,
they're contextual, so they're not universal, right?
yeah,
But everything is contextual. That doesn't make it less true. Like speed is relative, but that doesn't make it less real. And
yeah,
the sustainability is relative, but that doesn't make it less real. A lot of people get offended that I say sustainability instead of like goodness.
oh no, and yeah, I reach for well-being,
Right.
um
Which
and
which I think a little more forward thinking than even though sustainability is more forward thinking than say survival. People say survival, but usually that has like a short term connotation.
yeah,
Sustainability, longer term connotation, but means the same thing, right?
yeah,
Well, being is one further, I think. It's like um it's not just into the future, but it's also like laterally, it isn't enough for us
yeah,
to try to make the future better. We have to try to make everything better in every direction that we can.
yeah. I think although like obviously I agree with sustainability, I feel like it's a more like a quantitative thing where like we're just saying this thing has to keep going, right?
It's the most measurable one. I use it because it's the most empirical value. People say
Yeah,
measure goodness, but you can measure sustainability with a clock.
yeah,
So it's very hard for people to say it's unempirical, that there are more and less sustainable ways to be, but that's really what we're saying when we're saying healthy. That's really what we're saying. and
but what if you
and
don't want to be healthy?
well, then once because it's unhealthy to not want to be healthy.
Yeah, to me that's the loop I'm stuck on, is like the and and it's because I think our physical systems, experiencing well-being is foundational to the whole conversation of morality.
Yeah, we couldn't
Like,
have a conversation about what goals to have if somebody hadn't already established some degree of well-being.
yeah, like the so to me, like the whole thing is rooted in the fact that we're like biological systems in an ecology, like, and this is already all in motion before we ever start talking about what's right and wrong.
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
and so to me that's like, okay, so maybe I can't tell you like objectively every move you should make for the rest of your life to be
No.
like a better person, but I do feel like our context puts bounds on the conversation,
Right.
and if you're
Right.
outside of those bounds you're wrong. Like
Not just
like
wrong, not just wrong, but entirely irrelevant to the conversation. Like
exactly.
the extent to which you are outside of those bounds is the extent to which you are irrelevant.
So
Like,
that's what I'm stuck on, and it doesn't matter to me at all like whether the is ought thing is like solved or not solved. Like I'm actually like
I think that
uh
is, I think that's a definitional game. Like, it is. You say, yeah, I say that should means what is best for us, right? What we should do, what is best for us. And they say should is what the best way to achieve a goal. And you say, well, I think that that secondary definition is not coherent. It doesn't make sense on its own. It if I say in the way that we use the word should, it doesn't make sense. If I say that you should go to the store, if you really believe that should is the best way to achieve a goal, then whatever you already want to do in whatever action that you already are doing it is the only thing that you ever should do. Right? Isn't that true? So there's no such thing as should according to that definition at all. There's no such thing. And yet, so your own definition eliminates the word that it's trying to describe. And then this definition is the way that all human beings use it. Should is what is best for you. So if your mom says you shouldn't walk out across the street, and then you say why, they say, well, because you'll get hit by a car. It's not good for you to be hit by cars. Or if you say you shouldn't have the goal of dying. You say, why shouldn't you? Because you won't get to be. That's not the best way for you to be, because there is no you in that world.
they
Right?
stop, the mother stops and says, well, little Timmy, if you wish to continue surviving. Like I don't know. And I mean if we need like an explicit like if then type statement to like get us going, like that's fine. Like I don't, but to me, and the reason in that thread that I brought up the concept of sanity is because I feel like, we're talking about like this very real objective context that we
Yeah.
exist within, that we don't choose, we're just in it already and it's in motion, you know. If we're talking about things that don't recognize that context and that are outside of it, I feel like that lacks sanity. Like
Yeah.
we're
Yes.
outside of the real world, and but people will still include that space in the conversation. And
I,
I'm like, no, 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 we gotta cut that out of the conversation
I,
before we
I
can make sense over here. Like in
100% agree that, like, when we ask the question, how should we live? We should exclude all people who don't want to live. Like, that doesn't make what they will
uh,
themselves, and we'll still be left with the question, you
yeah,
know?
although I will say, like in that same thread, that I keep referring to this conversation that
Oh,
like
that's
the viewers won't be privy to. So I apologize if
okay.
to anyone that's watching this that's like getting bored. But in that same conversation, it was brought up the idea that like someone who is not like of advanced age, but was more middle-aged, but they had such suffering through mental illness that we had no way of relieving, like, and that person desired to end their life. I could see in the larger system of, if we're thinking about like the wellness of society, if we're thinking about like the wellness of communities.
How it would cost us to try to make people survive, how
Yeah, I could.
lives would be detriment, would experience some negative effect of trying to witness this suffering or trying to force this suffering to exist.
Yeah, I could see how like call it harm reduction,
Yes.
that like
Yeah.
like forcing this person to have like this miserable existence that there was no way out of, that they could perceive, or that we as a society could perceive. We're just making this person continue to exist in misery. I can see how, opting out of that might be a valid option.
I 100% agree on the basis of the well-being of the rest of the people, right? Not on that person's basis, but on the basis of the well-being of the rest of people. I don't think that it's necessary for us to make them survive. And if that person was alone on a desert island, then the question doesn't even come up, like
They don't have to argue with anybody.
yeah, exactly. And if they're
Oh my
interacting,
God, that's terrible. It's true.
if I am having to have an effect on other people, then I'm gonna have to take their well-being into account anyway, and that means that those people are going to be allowed to leave when there is no better option. But that doesn't mean that the goal isn't still to live, right? Like we are living creatures. Our goal is intrinsic in our natures. Like there's like what
Right.
there is a function to anatomy. Like every anatomical structure has a function that it evolved to achieve, right? And that description of its utility allows us to predict aspects of the system before we ever encounter them, because we know the end of the machine, right? The machines come with teleology built into them.
Right.
And it to be to act against that is to unmake yourself. Those are one and the same. And I don't know. So when we though, if we take that same question, there's a suicidal person and they're miserable, but now I can give them a pill and they're happy for the rest of their lives. Should we listen to them when they say they want to kill themselves? It seems to me like it's entirely possible for me to not know what I want. Yeah, I have kids. I've seen them do it.
Yeah.
They think that they want to stay up all night, right? They don't. They will be miserable. They will be absolutely, they will cry and scream and not know why they're upset, but they think that they want to stay up all night. The truth is that they want to sleep and don't know it. And it's possible. It's okay.
Oh, I was gonna say, to me, this is like the role of sanity in this conversation, and like I'm not gonna like throw out answers like based on like hypotheticals with like 3 facts involved and no context or anything, but like it's really, to me, what needs to happen is we have to form like a cultural level sanity around these discussions,
Yeah.
and it has to concern like the well-being of everyone, and
Or,
it can't.
or it can't be sane if it doesn't. It will be self-destructive or
Yeah,
self-indulgent.
and it can't, like you were saying, it can't just be based off so and so said something, like, because like we mentioned earlier, like the or like you mentioned just now, like we don't really know what we need all that well.
Right.
We can only
Yeah.
establish those things collectively, and we don't have that level of privilege about our own process, even though we feel like we should.
We feel like we should. We feel like I should be the dictator of what I need. I say, well, I know that I when I'm like this, I just need to go sit in my chair and watch TV and it'll go away. And he's like, yes, but I'm a doctor and you need exercise or else you will keep experiencing this, and
Yeah.
we might think, no, I don't want to exercise. But when we ask people who do it regularly, they say that they do. And unless you think that you're a different kind of human being, you are just wrong about what it is like, about what you want.
Yeah.
Well, some people claim that they literally cannot be wrong about their goals. And then those people, I think, are insane to the extent that they believe that.
Yeah, or at least they're not respecting the larger context that they exist within. And like, I don't, to me, it's like sawing the limb out from under you. Like
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's like you're not really observing. Like, I mean, you can do that if you want, and you can
Well,
fall and you can say like,
whether or not you can doesn't say whether or not you should,
right.
and I know they're going to say, well, sure, that's the best way to achieve a goal. And I will talk to them if they want about how that eliminates the definition of should, and it doesn't exist in your world then. And then so what you're saying, and so what you should have said is there's no such thing as should, right? That's what you should say when you, but you don't say that. You want to be sneaky and
Should not exist. What?
Yeah. People point out that the is ought divide is itself an ought. You know.
Well, yeah, I mean that's the whole not to borrow from Sam Harris, but that's the whole Sam Harris argument, is that you can't get to is without previous oughts. Like we can't
Right.
agree on what exists without agreeing on like
How
how to
decide?
determine it. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's dependent upon values.
Yeah.
And some values in that process like we recognize as invalid. Like, and it's I
Produce that don't map to the world. You know.
yeah, and that's not necessarily the way I look at it, but I think that that's like instructional in some
Yes.
way at least.
You hear how I look at it. I do a lot of moralizing. I think that there are better and worse ways to be. I think that there are better. I
Yeah,
think that we should parent other adults to so the society should parent adults to some degree. Not that, as we said earlier, that we should eliminate autonomy because we have to encourage them to self-develop so that because society is built out of individuals,
yeah,
but we can't give people an absolute free reign to design any moral system that they want, and we don't. We physically stop people from doing harm, you know.
right. If we actually like pursued that all the way, like then we
We
couldn't hold things together. Like we couldn't hold the social project we all exist within together.
right. Yes. Yeah. Understanding the world in an accurate and meaningful way, you know, meaningful in terms of being able to act in the world. That requires that we have certain values, and any civilization that doesn't will be displaced by ones that do.
Yeah, yeah. But what if that's what you want? What if you
Well,
want
that
civilization to be just
ask yourself, if you in the very next second wanted to put your hand on a stove burner, right? If you wanted to, and then immediately afterward you didn't want to, which ones of those is more true? Like, are they both to the equal extent? Is it possible for your wants to change moment to moment? And is there an aggregate? Is there an average of our wants that is more true to us, or is it possible for you to disidentify with the want that comes up in your life that's temporarily insane? That never happens to me. I don't even know why that happened. You know, is it possible for that to happen? If it is, then you don't believe that sentence. You don't believe the sentence that my wants in the current moment are prime and everything else is secondary. You know, and I don't
yeah,
think anyone really believes that sentence. Like, this is the most hedonistic way that you could think. People who would believe that way would get selected out and would be replaced by people with different values, which probably already happened, which is why we can impede our desires, you know.
yeah. No, like to me, it's just like I feel like in that conversation, a lot of times, we just we just lose track of the fact that there's like we're already in motion in this process. Like we're like,
there's a
and
great there's a greater context, and that's,
yeah,
but I point out that there's a greater context of personal desire to you, sir,
right,
that what I want right now is really me. You say, is that true? Because if your mood changes, you want different things. Are you saying that's not you anymore, that I don't have to stay married to this person, like that you can't have access to your bank account because you don't feel that way anymore, and now all of a sudden your priorities are to become a football star? You know, is it I don't think that you truly identify with only the desires that you have in this sentence. I don't think that you do. And I think that you're misrepresenting your identity. In truth, we we are the whole thing. There is no separation between my future selves that want different things and my past selves that want different things, but also you and me. There's not a huge difference between like me being me and you being Chet, other than where we're
right.
standing, you know. And if we can accept that identity is a larger gradient, that we are part of the bigger, greater context, then we cannot solely identify with our moment to moment desires, or it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I'm very much people talk about the importance of like non-duality a lot.
Yeah,
But I'm very much I same concept basically, but like different approach. Like I very much think of myself as a monist, as like making a positive statement about the fact that like,
Everything is one thing.
yeah, I am like a piece in this very large process, and I don't see where the divisions in that process are cleanly, at least.
Well, the
Obviously,
thing,
I can recognize we're two different physiological systems, but
but
we're the same
they're,
ecological system.
they're like poles that have gradients into each other. They're not
Right.
perfectly discrete from one another. If I zoom in on the side of a cup, it will recede before me. That line will recede before me like a horizon, and I will never actually reach the edge of the cup that separates it from the air. And there, as I zoom in, I will reach a bumpy landscape. And as I zoom in on one of those bumps, the line between the this electron and this electron cease to exist. They fade into each other. I'm never going to find a perfect like the horizon isn't real. You know?
Yeah, I think you can say objectively, like my interests as a human uh, are, or at least should be, uh, compatible and aligned with the interests of other humans, the interests of, you know,
If you
the other creatures that we share this space with. Like, and I know that that's like an idealistic thing, but it also to me seems like the rational path that like
same,
if we're
yeah.
gonna make sense, we have to think on those scales.
There isn't a reason or a justification for separating yourself from the rest of reality and then subjugating it to you. Like there's not a reason, and we do
Yeah,
it we do it because it's easier. It is quite simply easier to say I am than it is to describe yourself in the components. Like that is a much more complicated idea, and it requires a lot more facts and work. And it is
yeah.
really easy just to say, well, this is me, and everything that I don't already know is not me, and I don't want it. That's just an easier way to be. But then they claim that we're being, you know, not they won't say lazy. They're like idealistic. But if I had to choose, I'd rather be idealistic than lazy.
I feel like, yeah, I feel like the division more than anything, especially if you look at the subject of like weird psychology about like biases and like I forget what the acronym is like Western industrial educated rich democracies. Um that we have a perceptual bias about the world that
Yeah,
isn't shared with other cultures and societies, and I feel like we lean heavily on those perceptual biases in our reasoning, and I don't think that's necessarily valid. Like I think we have to question the biases of our like local context that we are developed within.
I was fortunate to be born into a family with no authority figures. So I was already firmly in that mindset that nobody knows what they're doing way before I became an adult and realized that nobody knows what they're doing for real. No.
It was only
But that,
confirmed.
but it made it easier for me to reject. Like there are no men in my life as a little kid. You know, they're just not, the men that came through very short periods of time and then left. And so when I grow up and go into the workplace and I hear men talking, I'm like, oh my god, I cannot believe that we. And I feel like I was spared a lot of cultural indoctrination by being a latchkey kid. You
Yeah,
know.
yeah. Well, Derek, we've been talking a long time.
Yeah.
In the interest of anyone actually watching the whole video, we should probably cut it off.
Yeah.
But
3% on my phone.
I'm sorry.
I said I've got 3% left on my phone,
Holy
so it's
shit. But man, I appreciate your time so much. This has been like a super stimulating conversation.
no problem.
Um, I'm trying to think what with your last 3%, is there anything else you want to throw out there before we wrap it up?
Um, well, I agree with Wittgenstein when in the idea that there is only the truth. There's the body of facts. What we call embodied truth is the truth that we can find, you know, but that doesn't stop being unembodied simply because it's not accessible to us. I don't think that there's a separation between form and substance, and I don't think that there is a real dichotomy between mental objects or facts that and their instantiation in the world. I don't think that that really exists. I think that the behaviors of mental objects inside of our head rely just as much on the laws of physics as the ones out there, and
Mm-hmm.
that similarity that they have allows our ideas to model those things, but it depends on a real physical similarity that they have. But I don't think that I think that we make a very serious mistake in trying to separate the mental and the physical in the world, and that really we should be trying to describe all mental operations in terms of physical.
Absolutely. 1,000% agree. Um, yeah, man. Thank you so much for doing this. If anyone's still watching,
This was
oh, go ahead.
this was really fun, and you're a very interesting person to talk to, Chet. I'm glad you're doing this.
Awesome. Awesome. I appreciate it. If anyone's still watching, thank you for watching us. I've got, I think one more interview, for like this set that I need to get set up. And then probably going to be taking a break for a while because I got other things going on in my life. I am so exhausted right now.
Hey, you
But
one every week. That's crazy.
yeah, people might not guess, but I'm an introvert, and this sort of thing is like taxing. I love it, but I'm like gonna go take a nap.
For sure.
Anyways, so yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up. Thank you, everybody, and I hope you all have a beautiful day.